Welcome, listeners, to Tales by Imon. Settle in as we journey to a town that's not quite what it seems in our story, The Outsider's Guide to Prosperity Peak. Chapter 1. The sign that welcomed Liam to Prosperity Peak was made of solid, dark oak, with letters carved so deep and perfect they looked like they were imprinted by machine, not by hand. Prosperity Peak, it declared in elegant, confident script. Population, 2,841. A better life awaits. Liam snorted, a dry, humorless sound that was lost in the purr of his beat-up sedan. The car was the only thing he owned that felt truly his, a rolling testament to his life in Chicago, a life of crowded streets, relentless noise, and the constant, grinding pressure to be someone he wasn't. This sign, with its cheerful, almost smug promise, felt like a personal insult. He had been driving for 2 days straight, fueled by cheap coffee and the bewildering news of a great uncle he barely remembered. Arthur Vance. A name that was more of a whisper from his childhood than an actual memory. And now, Arthur was gone, leaving behind the one thing Liam never expected to inherit, a bookstore. Not just any bookstore, but one in a town he'd never even heard of until a lawyer with a nasally voice had called him last week. As he drove past the sign, the world seemed to shift. The wild, unkempt nature of the highway gave way to perfectly manicured lawns, each blade of grass seemingly standing at attention. The houses were a mix of charming Victorian and sturdy craftsman styles, painted in muted, pleasant colors. There wasn't a single peeling paint chip or overgrown weed in sight. It was unervingly perfect. It looked less like a real town and more like a movie set, one where the director had an obsessive eye for detail. His phone lost signal 2 miles back, leaving the car's GPS screen blank and useless. But the lawyer's directions were simple enough. The bookstore, Vance's Pages, was right on Main Street, across from the town square. Finding it was easy. Main Street was a postcard from a forgotten era. A bakery with a cheerful striped awning, a hardware store with a wooden rocking chair out front, and a diner with a buzzing neon sign that read, Gus's Grub. And there, nestled between a flower shop and a real estate office, was his inheritance. Vance's Pages. The letters on the sign were faded, the gold leaf peeling away, a stark contrast to the rest of the town's pristine facade. It was the only building that looked its age. Liam parked the car, the engine sputtering to a reluctant stop. For a moment, he just sat there, staring. The large display window was crammed with books, stacked in precarious towers, their spines faded by years of sunlight. A fine layer of dust coated everything, giving the whole place a dreamlike, hazy quality. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was his problem now. He was supposed to clear it out, sell the property, and get back to his real life. A life that, if he was being honest, consisted of a tiny apartment and a freelance writing career that was barely paying the bills. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car. The air here was different. Clean, crisp, with a faint scent of pine from the towering mountains that loomed over the town like silent guardians. The silence was the most jarring part. There were no distant sirens, no honking cars, just the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant chime of a bell. He fumbled with the old iron key the lawyer had mailed him. It felt heavy and ancient in his hand. The lock groaned in protest, but finally, with a satisfying click, the door swung open. A small bell, tarnished with age, announced his arrival to an empty room. The smell hit him first, the rich, earthy scent of old paper, leather, and dust. It was the smell of forgotten stories, of time itself. Books were everywhere. Not just on the towering wooden shelves that reached for the ceiling, but in stacks on the floor, on chairs, on every available surface. It was organized chaos, a labyrinth of literature. In the center of the room was a large, worn-out leather armchair, the ghost of his great-uncle Arthur still imprinted in its cushions. Liam ran a hand through his already messy hair. This was more than a week's work. This was a monumental task. He took a few steps in, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. He pulled a book from a nearby shelf. It was a collection of seafaring adventures, its cover frayed at the edges. Inside the front cover, in elegant spidery handwriting, was a note. The greatest journeys are not to new lands, but to new ways of seeing. Arthur Vance. Before he could explore further, the bell on the door chimed again. He turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. She was immaculately dressed in a crisp pantsuit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe but elegant bun. She smiled, a bright, polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Liam," she said, her voice smooth and confident. She stepped inside, her presence seeming to suck the very dust from the air. "I'm Evelyn Reed, the mayor of Prosperity Peak. I wanted to be the first to officially welcome you."
Oh,
"Hi," Liam managed, feeling underdressed and out of place in his faded jeans and wrinkled t-shirt. "Thanks." I'm just here to sort things out. Of course, she said, her eyes scanning the cluttered shop with a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Disapproval. Pity. Arthur was a beloved, if eccentric, part of our community. We were all so sorry to hear of his passing. But we are thrilled to have new blood in town. New energy. I don't think I'll be staying long, Liam said quickly. Just long enough to handle the estate. Mayor Reed's smile tightened ever so slightly. Many people say that when they first arrive. But Prosperity Peak has a way of growing on you. We have a very particular way of life here. Orderly, peaceful, prosperous. I'm sure you'll find it a welcome change from wherever you've come from. She didn't have to say Chicago. The judgment was clear in her tone. She handed him a pristine white business card. The town council is having a small welcome reception for you this Friday at the community hall. Nothing fancy, just a chance for you to meet your new neighbors. We do hope you'll come. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. I'll try, Liam said, tucking the card into his pocket. Excellent, she said, her smile returning to full wattage. Welcome to Prosperity Peak, Liam. I'm sure you're going to fit right in. She turned and left as quickly as she had arrived, the bell chiming her departure. Liam stood in the silence, the mayor's words echoing in the dusty air. Fit right in. He had never fit in anywhere. Why would this strangely perfect town be any different? He felt a sudden, desperate need for coffee and a dose of reality. He locked the bookstore, the old lock clicking shut with a sense of finality, and walked across the street to Gus's Grub. The diner was the polar opposite of the world outside. It was lived in, with cracked vinyl booths, a long formica countertop, and the comforting smell of grease and brewing coffee. An older man with a formidable belly and a kind, weary face stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. What can I get for you? The man grunted, not looking up. Just a black coffee to go, Liam said, sliding onto a stool. The man finally looked at him, his gaze sharp and appraising. You're the new fella. Arthur's boy. Great nephew, actually. Liam. Gus, the man said, nodding as he poured coffee into a paper cup. Heard you were coming. Word gets around fast here. I'm learning that, Liam said, thinking of the mayor's sudden appearance. Gus slid the coffee across the counter. $2. Liam paid, and as he was about to leave, Gus spoke again, his voice low. Your great-uncle, Arthur. He was a good man. Kept to himself mostly. Read his books. He saw things a little differently than most folks round here. How so? Liam asked, intrigued. Gus shrugged, his eyes darting towards the front window as if checking for eavesdroppers. This town, it likes things a certain way. Neat. Tidy. Predictable. Arthur, he preferred the messy chapters of life. Just be careful what you go digging for in that old shop of his. Not all stories are meant to be read. The cryptic warning hung in the air. Before Liam could ask what he meant, the bell on the diner door jingled, and a family with 3 smiling, perfectly behaved children came in. The moment was broken. Liam nodded at Gus, a silent thank you, and walked back out into the quiet sunshine of Main Street. Back in the dusty silence of Vance's pages, Gus's words replayed in his mind. Not all stories are meant to be read. He looked around the shop, at the towering shelves of silent books. What secrets was this place holding? He started in the back, in a small office cluttered with stacks of paper, old ledgers, and more books. He spent hours just trying to clear a path to the desk. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows through the dusty windows, his foot hit a loose floorboard. Curious, he knelt down and pried it up. Underneath, nestled in the dark space, was a small, tin box. It wasn't locked. With a sense of trepidation, he lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal and a single ornate brass key. He picked up the journal. It was worn, the leather soft from years of handling. He opened it to the first page. The same elegant, spidery handwriting from the book he'd found earlier filled the page. The entry was dated just 2 months before his great-uncle's death. It read, "They call this place Prosperity Peak, and they believe their peace is a reward for their conformity. They follow the guide, they adhere to the rules, and they reap the benefits. But I am beginning to suspect it is not a reward. It is a cage, and I fear I have just found the key to the lock." Liam's heart pounded in his chest. He looked from the cryptic entry to the brass key resting in the box. A guide. Rules. A cage. Suddenly, the perfect lawns and the overly friendly smiles of Prosperity Peak seemed less charming and more sinister. He was no longer just an outsider cleaning out an old bookstore. He was an outsider who had just stumbled upon the first chapter of a story far more complex and dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The last sliver of sunlight vanished behind the mountains, plunging the bookstore into a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by a single beam of light from the street lamp outside. Liam sat on the dusty floor, the cold tin box in his lap. The words from his great uncle's journal seemed to hang in the air, tangible and heavy. A cage. A key. A lock. He switched on his phone's flashlight, the bright LED beam cutting through the gloom and illuminating the small leather journal in his hand. He needed more. That one entry was a hook, and it was firmly lodged in his mind. He turned the page, his fingers tracing the delicate, almost frantic handwriting. The next entry was dated a week later. They speak of the harmonizing. It is a concept woven into the very fabric of this town. It is in the way they greet each other, the way they tend their gardens in unspoken synchronicity. They believe it is the source of their prosperity, a collective alignment of purpose and spirit. But alignment requires pressure. Harmony requires the silencing of discordant notes. I saw what happened to Mr. Abernathy when his prize-winning roses bloomed a day late for the festival. They called it retuning. He hasn't been the same since. Liam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Retuning. It sounded clinical, sanitized, and utterly terrifying. He flipped through several more pages, which were filled with observations about local flora and historical anecdotes, almost as if Arthur was trying to distract himself. Then, he found another entry that stood out. Discord is the ultimate sin in Prosperity Peak. It is treated like a contagion. An unkempt lawn, a late bill, a dissenting opinion at a town meeting, these are not minor infractions. They are cracks in the foundation of their perfect world. They believe the Founders Accord protects them, but it also binds them. Every resident is a signatory, whether they know it or not. I fear I am becoming a discordant note myself, simply by asking questions. Liam closed the journal, his mind racing. The Founders Accord. The harmonizing. This was starting to sound less like a quirky small town, and more like a cult with excellent landscaping. He picked up the brass key from the box. It felt cold and heavy in his palm. It was an old skeleton key, but the bow was unusual, etched with an intricate symbol, a perfect circle with a single, straight vertical line running through its center. It was simple, elegant, and vaguely unsettling. What did it open? Gus's warning echoed in his ears. Be careful what you go digging for. Was this what he meant? Driven by a restless energy, Liam began his search. He tried the key on the antique roll-top desk in the office. It didn't fit. He tried it on a large, padlocked wooden chest in the corner of the main room. The key was too small. He spent the next hour trying it on every lock he could find in the store. Cabinets, drawers, a small safe he found hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. Nothing. The key remained a stubborn, silent mystery. Frustrated, he pocketed the key and the journal and decided to get some air. He needed to clear his head, to see the town again through this new, darker lens. He locked up the bookstore and stepped out onto Main Street. Night had fully settled, but the town was anything but dark. Every porch had a soft, welcoming light on. Every shop window was tastefully illuminated. It was quiet, but it was the same oppressive, unnatural quiet from before. He started walking, his footsteps loud on the empty sidewalk. He passed Gus's grub, now dark and silent. He walked past the pristine town square, the white gazebo glowing like a ghost under the moonlight. He began to notice the things Arthur's journal had hinted at. The houses he passed all had their sprinklers on, and he realized with a jolt that they all turned on and off in perfect, synchronized pulses. The curtains in the windows were all drawn, but not a single one was crooked or out of place. There were no sounds of televisions, no arguments, no laughter. It was a town holding its breath. As he turned onto a residential street named Sycamore Lane, he saw a woman tending to her garden, even at this late hour, illuminated by a small lamp. It was the woman from the flower shop next to the bookstore. She looked up as he approached, her face breaking into a wide, practiced smile. "Good evening," she called out, her voice a pleasant, melodic chime. "You're Mr. Vance, from the bookstore. I'm Carol. We're neighbors." "Liam," he corrected her. "Nice to meet you. Enjoying our peaceful evening?" she asked, snipping a stray leaf from a perfectly spherical bush. "It's one of the best things about living in Prosperity Peak. The tranquility. It's essential for the harmonizing." There it was again. That word. "I was just reading about that," Liam said, testing the waters. "In one of my great-uncle's journals." Carol's smile didn't falter, but her eyes became guarded. Oh, Arthur. He was such a historian. always digging into the past. But we prefer to look forward, towards a more harmonious future. You're coming to the welcome reception on Friday, I hope? Participation is so important for community cohesion. The mayor mentioned it, Liam said non-committally. Wonderful. You'll see what we're all about. Everyone doing their part to create a perfect whole, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She gave one last, final snip to the bush. Well, I must finish up. The Bloom Festival is next month, and every petal counts. She gave him a cheerful little wave and turned back to her work, her focus absolute. Liam walked away feeling more unnerved than ever. Her words were friendly, but they felt like a script. Participation is important. Every petal counts. It was the language of conformity, of pressure disguised as community spirit. He returned to the bookstore, the comfortable scent of old paper now feeling less like a refuge and more like a tomb. He sat down at the dusty desk in the back office, the journal and key laid out before him. Gus had said Arthur saw things differently. Carol had called him a historian. He was clearly looking for something, trying to understand the town's strange mechanics. His eyes scanned the chaotic piles of books and papers on the desk. He wasn't just going to clean this place out. He was going to find what his great-uncle was looking for. He started to methodically sort through the clutter, looking for anything related to the town's history or its founders. After nearly an hour, he found it. Not a map or a hidden letter, but a book. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, much older than the others around it. It had no title on the spine. It looked like a personal ledger, but it was heavy, like a family Bible. He wiped the dust from the cover with the sleeve of his shirt. And then he froze. There, embossed in the center of the worn leather cover, was a faint but unmistakable symbol. It was a perfect circle, with a single, straight vertical line running through its center. The same symbol that was etched into the brass key. He looked from the book to the key in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't just a book about the town's history. It was connected. Arthur hadn't just found the key to a lock. He had found the key to understanding everything. And now, that key was in Liam's hands. The only question was whether he had the courage to turn it. The old book felt impossibly heavy in Liam's hands, a weight that was more than just paper and leather. It felt like the condensed history of a town, a silent, sleeping thing that held a century of secrets. His fingers traced the symbol on the cover, the circle with the vertical line, a perfect match for the key. He looked at the side of the book and saw it, a small, tarnished brass lock, built into the cover itself, holding the pages shut. His breath hitched. It wasn't just a symbol of ownership, it was a literal lock. With a slightly trembling hand, he picked up the brass key. He slid it into the keyhole. It was a perfect fit. For a moment, he hesitated, the warnings from Gus and his great-uncle's journal swirling in his mind. This felt like a point of no return. But the curiosity, the gnawing need to understand the suffocating perfection of this place, was stronger than his fear. He turned the key. There was a soft metallic click that sounded deafeningly loud in the silent office. The clasp sprang open. He opened the book. The first page was thick, yellowed parchment, and the title was written in ornate, hand-drawn calligraphy. The Founders Accord and the Prosperity Peak Register. Below the title, a single line, for the perpetual harmony and enduring prosperity of our community. The first section was the accord itself. Liam scanned the pages, his sense of unease growing with every sentence. The language was archaic and utopian, full of grand pronouncements about community, contribution, and unity. It spoke of the town as a single living organism, and each resident as a cell whose sole purpose was to serve the whole. It mentioned communal assessments, harmony adjustments, and the rectification of discordant elements. It was a founding charter for a step-forward town, a rulebook for a beautiful prison. But it was the second, much larger section that made the blood run cold in his veins. The Prosperity Peak Register. Page after page was filled with names, written in meticulous, uniform script. The book was a ledger of souls. Each entry was organized into neat columns. The first was resident name. The second, date of arrival. The third, designated contribution. And the final, most chilling column was titled simply, status. His eyes darted down the first page, seeing names from the late 1800s. The status column for them was mostly filled with words like fulfilled or departed. But as he moved into the modern era, the entries changed. He saw the word harmonized appear again and again. With a knot of dread in his stomach, he started flipping through the pages, looking for familiar names. He found Mayor Evelyn Reed first. Resident name, Evelyn Reed. Date of arrival, 1995. Designated contribution, civic leadership and order. Status, exemplary harmonization. Of course. He kept searching until he found the diner owner. Resident name, Augustus Gus Petrov. Date of arrival, 1968. Designated contribution, sustenance and community hub. Status, harmonized, legacy. The word legacy was intriguing. Did it mean he was born here? That his family had a history with this place? Then he looked for the name from Arthur's journal. Abernathy. There he was. Resident name, Howard Abernathy. Date of arrival, 2007. Designated contribution, horticulture and aesthetics. Status, retuned. The date next to the status was from just a few months ago. It was real. The sanitized, terrifying word from his great uncle's journal was right here, an official entry in an official book. Finally, with a deep breath, he looked for the name he most dreaded and needed to find. Vance, Arthur. His entry was near the back. Resident name, Arthur Vance. Date of arrival, 1972. Designated contribution, archivist and historian. Status, discordant. Under observation. Liam slumped back in the chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. His great-uncle wasn't just an eccentric old man. In the eyes of this town, he was a problem. A discordant element being watched. The bookstore wasn't just a business, it was his designated contribution. He was the town's memory keeper, and it seemed he had remembered things they wanted to forget. Liam now understood the looks he was getting. The mayor's cloying welcome, Carol's scripted friendliness. They weren't just welcoming a newcomer. They were assessing a new variable. They were trying to figure out if Arthur's discord had been passed down along with his property. The welcome reception on Friday was no longer an invitation. It was a test. An evaluation to see if he would harmonize or if he, too, was a discordant note that would need to be retuned. He closed the book, the heavy cover thudding shut. The silence of the bookstore felt different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. Every book on every shelf seemed like a silent witness to the town's oppressive secret. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't sit in this dusty tomb of secrets and just wait for Friday. He needed answers from a person, not a 100-year-old ledger. He needed to talk to someone who might just tell him the truth. Someone whose status was harmonized, legacy. He needed to talk to Gus. Slipping the small journal into his back pocket and carefully placing the heavy accord register into his worn messenger bag, Liam stood up. The bag felt like it was carrying a block of lead. He took the brass key and put it in his pocket, a small, cold piece of proof that he wasn't imagining things. He walked out of the bookstore and locked the door behind him. The morning had arrived. The sun was bright, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The cheerful facade of Prosperity Peak was fully on display. People were out now, walking dogs, sweeping their porches, and greeting each other with bright, uniform smiles. Every single one of them was in that book. Every one of them had a status. Harmonized. Under observation. Retuned. The disconnect between the sunny, peaceful scene and the dark truth in his bag was dizzying. He felt like he was walking through a dream, the only one who knew it was about to become a nightmare. He crossed the street, his feet moving with a purpose he hadn't felt since he'd arrived. He ignored the pleasant wave from Carol, who was now arranging a brilliant display of roses in front of her flower shop. He walked straight towards the buzzing neon sign of Gus's Grub. He had his great-uncle's questions, and now he had the town's own secret book. He was done being careful. He was going to start digging. He reached the diner's door, his hand hovering over the handle, the faint smell of coffee and bacon wafting from within. He took one last look at the perfect orderly town square, then pushed the door open, a bell chiming his arrival. The bell above the diner door announced Liam's arrival with a cheerful jingle that was completely at odds with the leaden weight in his stomach. The place was about half full, a mix of early risers and workers grabbing breakfast. The air buzzed with low chatter and the clinking of forks against ceramic plates. Everyone seemed to know each other, exchanging easy smiles and greetings. It was a picture of quaint small-town life, and knowing what he now knew, Liam found it profoundly menacing. Gus was behind the counter, flipping pancakes on a large griddle. He glanced up, his expression neutral, but Liam thought he saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there yesterday. "Back again," Gus stated, his voice a low rumble. "Coffee." "Please," Liam said, sliding onto the same stool as before. He placed his messenger bag on the floor next to him, acutely aware of the heavy secret it contained. He couldn't just pull the book out here, not with half the town within earshot. He would have to wait. He nursed his coffee, watching the diner's patrons. He saw the mailman, a cheerful man named Stan, according to the register. Status, harmonized. He saw a woman who ran the local hardware store. Status, harmonized. They were all in the book. They were all part of the system. He felt a profound sense of isolation, like a spy who had just realized he was the only one in the room who wasn't part of the conspiracy. Slowly, the breakfast rush dwindled. The other customers paid their bills, exchanged pleasantries with Gus, and left, the bell chiming their departures. Finally, there was only Liam. The diner fell into a quiet hush, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the sizzle of the griddle as Gus cleaned it. Gus wiped down the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Liam, but he knew the moment was coming. Something else you need, kid? This was it. Liam took a slow breath. I found something in my great uncle's bookstore. He reached down and lifted the heavy messenger bag, placing it on the counter with a solid thud. I think it belonged to the town. Gus stopped wiping. He looked at the bag, then at Liam, his face hardening. Lots of things in that old shop belonged to the town's history. Arthur was the keeper of it. This is more than history, Liam said, his voice low but firm. He unzipped the bag and pulled out the thick, leather-bound register. He laid it flat on the counter, the embossed symbol facing up. Gus's face went pale. For the first time since Liam had met him, the man's weary composure cracked. His eyes darted to the front windows, as if expecting the mayor to burst in at any moment. Put that away, he hissed, his voice a choked whisper. Now, are you insane? Probably, Liam admitted. But I need answers. I read it, Gus. I read about the Accord. About harmonizing. About retuning. I saw my great-uncle's entry. Discordant. Under observation. He leaned forward slightly. And I saw yours. Harmonized. Legacy. What does that mean, Gus? Gus stared at the book as if it were a venomous snake. He looked defeated, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a deep, ancient weariness. He let out a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Legacy means I was born here, he said quietly, finally meeting Liam's gaze. My family was one of the founding signatories. This Accord, it's my inheritance. I didn't choose it. I've just lived with it. He gestured for Liam to move to a booth in the far corner, away from the windows. Liam slid the book back into his bag and followed, sitting across from the diner owner. You weren't supposed to find that, Gus said, rubbing his tired eyes. Arthur must have hidden it. He was always looking for it. What is this all for? Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This control, this perfection. Why? Gus leaned back, his gaze distant. This town wasn't always prosperous. It was founded on the silver from the mountain. The prosperity peak mine. For a while, things were good, but the mine was unstable. In the winter of 1888, it collapsed. Took nearly 100 men with it. The town was devastated. Starvation, disease, despair. They were tearing each other apart. He paused, letting the grim history sink in. So the founders, the ones who were left, they created the Accord. A social contract. They believed that human nature, ambition, greed, individuality, was the cause of their downfall. So they designed a system to suppress it. Everyone gives up a little of themselves for the good of the whole. Everyone contributes. Everyone stays in line. In return, the town thrives. No crime, no poverty, no discord. And the harmonizing? Liam prompted. It's the constant, daily process of maintaining that balance, Gus explained. The community events, the festivals, the social pressure, it's all designed to keep everyone aligned. To keep us all singing the same tune, so to speak. And it works. Look around. The town is prosperous. But what about when someone sings a different tune? Liam asked, thinking of Mr. Abernathy and his late blooming roses. Gus's expression darkened. That's discord. And the system, it corrects it. Retuning, they call it now. It's for people who can't or won't harmonize. People who threaten the balance. They're taken for counseling. Sometimes for a few days, sometimes longer. When they come back. He trailed off, shaking his head. They're quieter, more agreeable. They fit in again, but the spark is gone. They're muted. The description sent a fresh wave of ice through Liam's veins. It was a psychological lobotomy, enforced by the community. My great-uncle, he knew all this? Arthur spent 40 years digging into it, Gus confirmed. He believed the accord wasn't a salvation, it was a curse. He thought the founders didn't just create a contract, they found something. Something in the old mine. Something that helps enforce the harmony. He thought the real secret of Prosperity Peak wasn't in that book you're holding. It's up there. Gus nodded his head towards the window, in the direction of the massive mountain that shadowed the town. In the collapsed mine. This was the piece Liam was missing. The source. The mechanism. He tried to get in? He was obsessed with it, Gus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He was always looking for old maps, searching for a way into the sealed-off tunnels. That's why they put him under observation. He was getting too close to the heart of things. I told him to let it go, to just keep his head down and serve his purpose. But he wouldn't listen. The bell on the door jingled, and Gus immediately straightened up, his professional mask snapping back into place. A young couple walked in, all smiles. "Morning, Gus." "Morning, folks," Gus said, his voice back to its normal grumble. He stood up from the booth. "That's all I can tell you, kid. You have the book. You know the basics. My advice, be like the rest of us. Go to the welcome party. Smile. Say you love it here. Find your place. Or get in your car and don't look back. Don't go looking for the same trouble that found your great-uncle." Liam watched as Gus went to serve the new couple, the conversation over. He sat in the booth for a few more minutes, the diner owner's words echoing in his head. The real secret is up there. He paid for his coffee and left, stepping back out into the bright, deceptive sunlight. He now had the what and the why. But Gus's story had opened up a whole new question. How? What had the founders found in that mine? He stood on the sidewalk, ignoring the perfectly synchronized rhythm of the town around him. He looked past the manicured lawns and the charming storefronts, his gaze fixed on the looming peak that gave the town its name. It wasn't just a mountain anymore. It was a place of secrets, a tomb, and the source of Prosperity Peak's terrifying harmony. Gus had given him a choice, conform or flee. But Liam knew there was a third option. The one his great-uncle Arthur had chosen. To find the truth. Leaving the diner, Liam felt as if a switch had been flipped. The vague atmospheric dread that had clung to him since his arrival had solidified into a cold, hard sense of purpose. Gus's story had given him a target. The Prosperity Peak mine. The source. He walked back to the bookstore not as its reluctant inheritor, but as an investigator continuing his great-uncle's last, unfinished work. The dusty, cluttered shop no longer felt like a prison of old paper. It was an archive, a base of operations. Arthur had been looking for a way into the mine for years. If there were any clues on how to do it, they would be here, hidden amongst the shelves. Liam went straight to the back office, his eyes scanning the room with new intensity. He wasn't just looking for journals now. He was looking for anything related to geology, cartography, or local mining history. He bypassed the fiction and poetry, pulling down heavy, leather-bound tomes on rock formations and survey techniques. 4 hours, he sorted through the chaos, creating piles of relevant and irrelevant material. In a large, dusty crate tucked under the desk, beneath a stack of old town ledgers, he found it. It was a portfolio made of thick, treated canvas. Untying the leather straps, he opened it to find a collection of maps. There were geological surveys from the late 1800s, town plans from the 1920s, and most importantly, several detailed topographical maps of the mountain itself. One map, in particular, caught his eye. It was more modern than the others, and it was covered in his great-uncle Arthur's spidery handwriting. Arthur had meticulously cross-referenced the old mining company's plans with the modern landscape. He had marked the main entrance, which Liam knew from the town's historical plaques was sealed with tons of concrete after the disaster. But Arthur had also marked other locations. Faint red circles dotted the mountainside, labeled Ventilation Shaft 3, Emergency Exit, Collapsed, and Surveyor's Tunnel. And then, on the remote eastern face of the mountain, far from any marked trails, there was a single hand-drawn symbol. It was a circle with a vertical line running through its center. The symbol from the key and the register. Next to it, Arthur had written a single cryptic note, the Founder's Path. Not on any official map. They didn't seal everything. Liam's heart pounded. This was it. A potential way in. A hidden entrance known only to his great-uncle, and likely to the town's founders. But getting there would be a treacherous hike, and exploring a collapsed mine was suicide without the right equipment. He made a list, a powerful flashlight, spare batteries, a good length of sturdy rope, a compass, and a durable backpack to carry it all. There was only one place in town to get those things. The hardware store. Taking a deep breath, he locked up the bookstore and walked 2 doors down. Peak Provisions and Hardware was as orderly and pristine as every other shop on Main Street. A man in his 50s with a kind face and thinning hair was meticulously arranging a display of hammers. The nameplate on his apron read, Dale. "Afternoon," Dale said, his smile immediate and welcoming. "What can I help you find today?" "Hi," Liam said, trying to sound casual. "I was thinking of doing some hiking, exploring the trails around the peak. I need some gear, a good flashlight, some rope." Dale's friendly expression didn't change, but his eyes held a new, analytical quality. "Hiking, huh? The main trails are pretty well maintained. Don't usually need rope for those. You planning on doing some climbing?" "Oh no, nothing like that," Liam lied, his own voice sounding unconvincing to his ears. "Just for safety, you know, in case of a fall. And I'm into photography. Thought I might explore some caves for interesting shots." The lie felt clumsy, pathetic. "Caves," Dale repeated slowly, nodding. "Right. Well, for that you'll want our best LED lantern. It's got a 300-meter beam. And for rope, I've got 50 feet of high-tensile nylon. Should be more than enough for safety." The subtext was deafening. Dale knew he was lying. Or, at the very least, he knew this was unusual. As Dale rang up the purchases, he made another casual comment. "You know, the community is having a welcome reception for you this Friday. Mayor Reed is very excited. It's a great chance to learn about all the safe, town-approved recreational activities we have here." It was a warning, wrapped in a friendly reminder. "We're watching you. Stay on the approved path." "Wouldn't miss it," Liam said, forcing a smile as he paid. He walked out of the store with his supplies, the bag feeling heavy with more than just its physical contents. He felt the weight of the town's scrutiny on his back. He cut across the town square, intending to go straight back to the bookstore, but he stopped. He sat on a bench facing the gazebo, the hardware bag at his feet. He watched the town. He saw children on the playground, their laughter seeming just a bit too polite, their movements on the swings strangely synchronized. He saw neighbors chatting over perfectly trimmed hedges, their smiles unwavering. This was the harmony Gus had talked about. The peaceful, prosperous cage his great-uncle had written about. Was he crazy for trying to rattle its bars? Gus's advice echoed in his head. Get in your car and don't look back. It was the sane thing to do. The safe thing. As he sat there, wrestling with his doubt, he glanced up at the town hall. In a second-floor window, he saw a figure. It was Mayor Evelyn Reed. She wasn't looking at a file or talking on the phone. She was standing perfectly still, looking directly down at him. Even from this distance, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. It was a look of pure, cold assessment. The moment stretched, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something to herself, before stepping back from the window and disappearing into the shadows. The encounter shattered his hesitation. It wasn't just a warning anymore, it was a challenge. They were watching him, waiting for him to fall in line. But he had his great-uncle's legacy to think about. He had the truth, or at least a piece of it, sitting in his messenger bag. Fleeing wasn't an option. Not anymore. He stood up, his resolve hardened into steel. He walked back to the bookstore, the mayor's cold gaze burned into his memory. Inside, he worked quickly. He laid out Arthur's annotated map on the floor. He packed the new backpack with the flashlight, the rope, a bottle of water, and some protein bars he'd found in his car. He added the heavy register, wrapped in cloth, and his great-uncle's journal. Lastly, he slipped the cold brass key into the zippered pocket of his jacket. He would wait for dusk. A nighttime ascent would be more dangerous, but it would give him the cover he needed. They were watching Main Street, but Arthur's note was clear. The path he needed to take wasn't on any official map. As the sun bled out behind the mountain, casting the town in hues of orange and purple, Liam shouldered the backpack. It felt right. He wasn't the cynical, aimless writer from Chicago anymore. He was Arthur Vance's great-nephew, and he was going to finish the story. He slipped out the back door of the bookstore, into the growing shadows of the alley, and headed for the mountain. The transition was abrupt. One moment, Liam was walking on the perfectly paved sidewalk of the last residential street. The next, he was stepping onto a barely there path of packed earth, swallowed by the encroaching forest. The manicured world of Prosperity Peak ended not with a fence or a gate, but with a simple, stark line where the wildness of the mountain refused to be tamed any further. The last of the glowing porch lights vanished behind a thick stand of pine trees, and he was alone in the gathering dark. The air immediately grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. The oppressive silence of the town was replaced by the subtle living sounds of the wilderness, The whisper of wind through the high branches, the chirping of crickets, the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. It should have been peaceful, but every snap of a twig in the undergrowth sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He felt exposed, a trespasser in a place he didn't belong. He pulled out the powerful flashlight he'd bought from Dale, its brilliant white beam cutting a sharp tunnel through the gloom. He unfolded Arthur's map, the paper crinkling loudly in the quiet. The trailhead was exactly where his great-uncle had marked it. From here, the path would climb steeply for 2 miles before dissolving into unmarked territory. The ascent was brutal. The trail was little more than a goat path, strewn with loose rocks and tangled roots that seemed designed to trip him. Within 30 minutes, his lungs were burning, and his legs, accustomed to the flat grit of Chicago, ached in protest. He was a city dweller, completely out of his element, and the mountains seemed to know it. He paused, leaning against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He swept the flashlight beam back down the path, but the lights of Prosperity Peak were completely gone, hidden by the curve of the mountain. There was no going back. He pushed on, driven by the image of Mayor Reed's cold stare and the memory of his great-uncle's desperate handwriting. He was following a ghost's trail, and he could feel the weight of that legacy with every step. The forest grew thicker, the trees taller, their branches knitting together a dense canopy that blotted out the last of the twilight. The world shrank to the circle of his flashlight beam. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He froze, sweeping the light through the dark woods around him. The beam caught the glint of 2 small eyes, low to the ground, which blinked once and then vanished. A raccoon or a fox, probably. But in his heightened state, his imagination supplied more sinister possibilities. He thought of the register, of the town's obsession with order. Would they let someone just walk up here, toward the source of their secret? Or were there watchers in the woods, guardians of the mountain's mystery? He checked the map again. According to Arthur's notes, he was getting close to a key landmark, a cluster of 3 enormous granite boulders, weathered into strange rounded shapes that looked like they'd been placed there by giants. He adjusted his course, leaving the faint trail and pushing through dense underbrush, using the compass to guide him. After another 20 minutes of scrambling over fallen logs and through thorny bushes, he saw them. His flashlight beam fell upon 3 colossal stones, each the size of a small car, balanced precariously on top of one another. They dominated the small clearing, silent and ancient. It was exactly as the map had indicated. He felt a surge of triumph. Arthur had been here. He was on the right path. From the boulders, the instructions were precise. Follow the dry creek bed north for 200 paces. Look for the wall of ivy on the rock face to the left. He found the creek bed, a shallow scar in the earth filled with smooth, pale stones. He began to count his steps, his heart hammering in his chest with anticipation. 198, 199, 200. He stopped and swept his light to the left. At first, he saw nothing but a sheer cliff face, a solid wall of dark rock. But then he noticed it, a thick, matted curtain of ivy, its leaves dark and waxy, clinging to the stone. It looked as if it had been growing there for 100 years. Behind the ivy, he pushed through the thick, clinging vines, their leaves cool and damp against his skin. And then he saw it. It wasn't a gaping cave or a large tunnel, but a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. It was perfectly hidden. No one would ever find it by accident. A blast of cold, stale air washed over him from the opening, carrying a strange metallic scent, like rust and ozone. He squeezed through the fissure and found himself in a small, sheltered alcove. Set into the rock at the back of the space was a door. It was made of thick, heavy oak, reinforced with bands of rusted iron. It looked ancient, immovable, and in its center was a heavy iron lock plate and a keyhole. He shone the flashlight on the plate, and his breath caught in his throat. Engraved into the rusted metal was the symbol, a perfect circle with a single, vertical line. This was it, the Founder's Path. With a trembling hand, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the cold, brass key. It felt like an artifact of immense power now, a key not just to a door, but to the entire mystery of Prosperity Peak. He pushed it into the lock. For a horrifying second, he thought it wouldn't turn. But then, with a grinding shriek of metal on metal that echoed in the small space, the ancient mechanism gave way. Click! The sound was final, irrevocable. He had unlocked the heart of the mountain. He pulled on the heavy iron ring that served as a handle. The door groaned in protest, scraping against the stone floor as he dragged it open just enough to slip through. Before him was a vast, oppressive blackness, a void that seemed to suck the very light from his flashlight. The air was frigid, still, and carried the scent of deep earth and something else he couldn't identify. a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He gave one last look back at the moonlit forest, a world of life and nature he was about to leave behind. Then, he turned, raised his flashlight, and stepped across the threshold, into the cold, silent heart of the mountain. The heavy oak door swung shut behind Liam with a deep, resonant thud, the sound swallowed instantly by the profound silence of the mine. The last connection to the outside world was severed. He was in a place that had not seen the light of day or felt a fresh breeze in over a century. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in from all sides. His flashlight beam, which had seemed so powerful in the forest, now felt like a fragile needle of light in an infinite blackness. He took a moment to let his eyes adjust, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The air was frigid and carried the sharp, clean scent of wet stone, but underneath it was that other smell, stronger now, a sterile, metallic tang like ozone after a lightning strike. And then there was the hum. It was almost too low to be a sound, more of a vibration that he felt in the soles of his boots and the bones of his skull. It was a constant, unnerving thrum, the mountain's secret heartbeat. The tunnel stretched forward, a straight, dark corridor carved from the living rock. Ancient wooden beams, slick with moisture and spotted with pale fungi, lined the walls and ceiling, groaning softly under the immense weight of the rock above. On the floor, a pair of rusted rails for carts disappeared into the gloom. Liam pulled out Arthur's map. The Founder's Path was a single, straight line leading deep into the mountain, toward a large chamber his great-uncle had simply marked with a large circled question mark. With a map in one hand and his flashlight in the other, he began to walk, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Every drip of water from the ceiling, every skittering pebble his boot dislodged, sounded like a gunshot in the dead quiet. He passed abandoned tools, their wooden handles rotted away, their metal heads coated in a thick layer of rust. He saw a pickaxe leaning against a wall, as if its owner had simply set it down and vanished. The sense of preserved history was immense and deeply unsettling. About a quarter of a mile in, he came to a chasm. A fissure had split the tunnel floor, creating a dark, 30-foot gap. A narrow, rickety-looking wooden bridge, its ropes frayed and its planks slick with damp, was the only way across. He tested it with his foot, and the whole structure swayed ominously. This had to be why he'd needed the rope. Unpacking the coil he'd bought from Dale, he secured one end around a sturdy rock formation and the other around his waist. Holding the rope as a safety line, he carefully made his way across the bridge, his eyes fixed forward, refusing to look down into the blackness that yawned below. Once he was safely on the other side, the hum grew noticeably stronger. The flashlight in his hand began to flicker erratically, the beam wavering as if struggling against some unseen interference. The metallic smell was sharp now, almost acrid. He felt a strange pressure in his ears, like the feeling during an airplane's descent. Whatever the Founders had found, he was getting closer to its source. The tunnel began to widen, the rough-hewn walls giving way to smoother, almost polished stone. Strange, intricate carvings covered the walls here. He stopped to examine them. They were all variations of the same symbol, the circle and the vertical line, interspersed with geometric patterns that seemed to pulse and shift in the flickering beam of his flashlight. This wasn't the work of miners. This was something else. A shrine, or a diagram. Finally, the narrow tunnel opened into a cavern so vast that his flashlight beam couldn't find the ceiling. The air here was vibrating, the hum so intense it was a palpable force, making his teeth ache. He had reached the place Arthur had marked on the map. And in the center of the cavern, he saw it. It was not silver. It was a colossal, crystalline structure, at least 50 feet high, that jutted from the cavern floor like a shard of frozen night. It was a deep, impossible black, with facets that didn't reflect his light but seemed to drink it, swallowing the beam into their dark, lustrous surfaces. The structure was the source of the hum, the source of the energy that permeated the entire mine. It was a geological anomaly unlike anything he had ever read about. Scattered around the base of the massive crystal was old, rusted equipment. But it wasn't mining gear. There were large metal dishes that looked like primitive antennae, coils of thick copper wire, and strange, archaic-looking control panels with levers and glass dials. The Founders hadn't just found this thing, they had harnessed it. Liam finally understood. The harmonizing wasn't just a social philosophy. It was a broadcast. This crystal, this dark, humming heart of the mountain, was emitting a frequency, a signal that was being amplified and directed at the town below. It was a constant, subliminal transmission that suppressed dissent and enforced conformity. The town's prosperity wasn't built on a contract. It was built on a form of mass, geological brainwashing. And retuning was likely a direct, concentrated dose. He circled the base of the crystal, his mind reeling from the implications. He was standing at the source of the town's very soul. As he swept his light across the floor, he noticed something tucked away in a small crevice behind one of the rusted machines. It was a weathered leather satchel. Arthur's. He knelt down and opened it. Inside was a collection of notebooks, even more detailed than the journal he'd found, filled with scientific observations, frequency measurements, and frantic, desperate theories. One passage, circled in red ink, stood out. It sings a song of unity, but it's a song without soul. It erodes the self, sanding down the sharp edges of personality until all that is left is a smooth, uniform surface. They don't control it. They only aim it. But I believe it can be disrupted. A counter signal. A discordant note loud enough to shatter the harmony. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the tunnel behind him. Scrape. Clink. It was the sound of a boot hitting a loose stone. Liam froze, his blood turning to ice. He wasn't alone. Someone had followed him. Or worse, someone had been waiting for him. He clicked off his flashlight, plunging the cavern into absolute, disorienting darkness. The only thing he could perceive was the deep, resonant hum of the crystal and the frantic, silent pounding of his own heart. He flattened himself against the cold rock wall behind the machine, his breath held tight in his chest, and listened. Another sound. A soft, scraping footstep, closer this time. Whoever it was, they were in the cavern with him. Trapped in the suffocating dark, Liam held his breath until his lungs burned. The only reality was the cold stone at his back, the leather of Arthur's satchel clutched in his hand, and the low, pervasive hum of the crystal. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with unspoken threat. He was a mouse in a maze, and the cat had just entered. A brilliant, clean beam of light sliced through the blackness. It was from a powerful flashlight, much like his own. It moved slowly, methodically, painting sections of the cavern in stark white light before moving on. It swept across the far wall, illuminating the strange geometric carvings. It traced the base of the colossal black crystal, lingering for a moment on the abandoned, rusted equipment. Liam pressed himself further into the shadows, making himself as small as possible. The beam swept closer, passing over his hiding spot so quickly that he wasn't sure if he'd been seen. He remained perfectly still, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The light continued its sweep and finally settled on the figure holding it, who had moved to the center of the cavern. It was Mayor Evelyn Reed. She stood bathed in the backglow of her own light, looking perfectly composed, her pantsuit immaculate even here, deep in the earth. She didn't look like a politician, she looked like a priestess in her unholy temple. She exuded an aura of calm, absolute authority. "You've seen our little secret, Liam," she said, her voice smooth and even, yet it carried effortlessly across the vast space, barely echoing. It was as if the humming air was designed to carry her words directly to him. "I admit, you're more resourceful than I anticipated. Just like your great-uncle." Slowly, Liam rose from his hiding place. There was no point in hiding anymore. He clicked on his own flashlight, its beam a defiant answer to hers. He held it steady, pointing it at the floor between them. "So this is it," he said, his own voice sounding rough and foreign. "This is the source of your perfect little town. A rock that brainwashes everyone into being pleasant." A thin smile touched Evelyn's lips. Brainwashing is such a crude term. The Founder's crystal doesn't wash anything away. It aligns. It harmonizes. It tunes us to a frequency of cooperation and peace. The very things your world, she said the word with palpable disdain, has forgotten how to achieve. You come from a place of noise, of chaos, of discord. Here, we have created a sanctuary. "You've created a cage," Liam shot back, his hand tightening on the satchel. "I read the register. I know about the retuning. You don't just align people, you break them. You erase whatever part of them doesn't fit your perfect pattern." "Sacrifice is necessary for prosperity," Evelyn stated, her voice hardening, losing its smooth edge. "A small sacrifice of selfish, discordant impulses for the benefit of true community. Is that so terrible?" Arthur never understood that. He saw only the cage, never the safety it provided. He wanted to destroy it, to liberate us. Can you imagine the chaos that would follow? The peace we have cultivated for over a century, shattered in an instant. People would be free. "Free to be what?" she countered, taking a step closer. "Free to be greedy and angry and afraid? We have eliminated those things. Here, everyone has a purpose. Everyone contributes. Everyone is cared for. There is no crime, no poverty, no loneliness. What we have is true prosperity. You were given a chance to be a part of that. Dale at the hardware store reported your purchases. We knew you were coming up here. This was your final test, Liam. And you have failed it spectacularly. The threat was clear. This was no longer a philosophical debate. So what now? Liam asked, his eyes darting towards the tunnel he'd come from. You retune me? Force me to fit in? Oh, it's far too late for a standard retuning, Evelyn said, her voice turning icy. You've seen the heart of our community. You've uncovered the core of our existence. Your discord is critical, but we are not unreasonable people. You have a choice. You can submit to an intensive harmonization procedure. It will be difficult, but you will emerge a contented, productive member of Prosperity Peak. Or, she let the word hang in the humming air. Or you will be treated as an existential threat. And we have very permanent ways of neutralizing such threats. Just as the finality of his situation began to sink in, Evelyn raised a small walkie-talkie to her lips. He's here. Secure the entrance. Liam's blood ran cold. He wasn't just facing her. He turned and saw two flashlight beams appear at the mouth of the tunnel he'd used, blocking his only escape route. He could make out two figures. One was built like Dale from the hardware store. They were the enforcers. He was trapped. Evelyn's smile was devoid of all warmth. It's over, Liam. Accept your place. But she was wrong. It wasn't his only escape route. His mind raced, recalling Arthur's map. The annotations. On the far side of the cavern, his great-uncle had drawn a dotted line leading away from the crystal, with a note. Ventilation shaft 7. Unstable. Leads to lower levels. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. I don't think I'll be accepting anything today, Liam said. In one swift motion, he swung his flashlight up, aiming the powerful beam directly into Evelyn's eyes. She cried out, momentarily blinded, stumbling back. It was the only chance he was going to get. Get him, she shrieked, her composure finally shattering. Liam didn't hesitate. Clutching the satchel, he broke into a dead sprint, not for the blocked entrance, but across the cavern floor, into the darkness on the other side of the humming crystal. The two men at the entrance shouted and started after him, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly through the cavern. He ran, his feet slipping on the damp stone, guided only by the memory of the map. He rounded the massive crystal, its hum a physical force that seemed to push against him. He swept his own light across the far wall, frantically searching. There, a dark, low opening, half hidden by a rockfall, exactly where Arthur's map had indicated. It was a ventilation shaft, barely 4 feet high. He could hear the heavy pounding footsteps of the men closing in behind him. Their lights were getting closer. With a final desperate burst of speed, he dove headfirst into the opening, scraping his shoulders on the rough rock. He landed hard on a steep, gravel-strewn slope, tumbling down into an even deeper, more oppressive blackness. Behind him, he heard Evelyn's enraged scream echo off the walls of the great cavern, a sound of fury and frustration. He had escaped, but he was far from safe. He was now lost in the unmapped, unstable depths of the mine. Liam landed in a chaotic tumble of rock and gravel, sliding 10 feet down a steep, narrow shaft before crashing against a wall of cold, damp earth. Pain flared in his shoulder where he'd hit the rock, and the flashlight flew from his grasp, skittering into the darkness. For a terrifying moment, he was plunged back into the absolute blackness, his ears ringing, the only sound the clatter of loose stones settling around him and the distant, echoing shouts of his pursuers. He scrambled frantically in the dark, his hands patting the loose scree, searching for the light. His fingers brushed against the cool metal cylinder, and he snatched it up. He fumbled with the switch, his heart seizing with the fear that it was broken. With a flicker and a buzz, the beam sputtered back to life, weaker now, casting a nervous, trembling light on his surroundings. He was in a small, cramped tunnel, much older and more dilapidated than the one he'd just fled. The air was thick with the dust of ages, and the wooden support beams were splintered and sagging, some having collapsed altogether, creating impassable blockades of rubble. He looked back up the slope he'd fallen down. There was no way to climb back up, and he could see the bobbing beams of the other flashlights at the top of the opening. He went down the old vent shaft. A voice, probably Dale's, yelled from above. "Don't follow him," Evelyn's voice cut through, sharp and cold as ice. "It's a death trap. The whole section is unstable. He's buried himself. Block the entrance. He's not getting out that way." The beams of light disappeared. Liam was alone, his escape route sealed. Evelyn's words echoed in his ears. He's buried himself. The thought sent a wave of claustrophobia washing over him, so powerful it almost made him retch. He was trapped, deep under a mountain, in a collapsing tomb. He fought down the panic, forcing himself to take a slow, ragged breath. Panicking would get him killed. He was still alive. He still had the satchel. He had to keep moving. He checked his supplies. His water bottle was dented but intact. The rope was still with him. And Arthur's research was safe. That was all that mattered. Consulting the map with his flickering flashlight, he confirmed his location. The ventilation shaft was a maze of intersecting tunnels, most of which were marked with Arthur's stark notation, collapsed. He had only one viable path forward, a narrow passage that wound deeper into the mountain. The next hour was a grueling ordeal. He squeezed through gaps in the rocks so tight they scraped the skin from his back. He crawled on his hands and knees over piles of treacherous, shifting rubble. Twice, he heard the groan of stressed rock from somewhere above and had to freeze, listening as a shower of dust and pebbles rained down, praying the ceiling wouldn't give way. The hum of the crystal was gone here, replaced by the groaning protests of a dying mine and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Finally, he found a small, relatively stable side chamber, a pocket carved out of the rock where a miner might have taken a break a century ago. He slid to the floor, his body screaming with exhaustion and pain. He needed to rest. He needed a plan. He took out Arthur's satchel and carefully removed the notebooks. He had only glanced at them in the cavern, but now he began to read, his flickering light illuminating his gray tunkle's frantic scrawl. It was all there. Arthur hadn't just been trying to understand the crystal. He'd been planning to destroy it. The notebooks were filled with complex physics and acoustic engineering. Liam, thanks to a few college courses, understood the gist of it. His great-uncle had discovered the crystal's secret weakness, sympathetic resonance. Like a singer shattering a wine glass with a specific note, Arthur believed the crystal could be destroyed by broadcasting a precise, complex counter-frequency at it. A sound that, in his poetic notes, he called the frequency of free will. He had spent years calculating this frequency, but the final piece of his plan was the most audacious. He had designed and started building a device to generate the signal. A compact, powerful sonic resonator. The components were a strange mix of modern electronics and archaic parts salvaged from the old equipment in the mine itself. Flipping to the last page of the final notebook, Liam found a hand-drawn diagram and a list. It was the plan for assembling the device. But the key component, the core oscillator, was missing. Below the diagram, Arthur had written his final entry. "They are watching me too closely now. I cannot finish the work here. I have to hide the prototype and the core. They would never think to look in the one place that represents my failure to them, the place they assume I have abandoned. It's all there, hidden behind the one story that started it all. The key isn't for the mine. Not just for the mine. The key is for the cage." Liam's mind raced. The place that represents my failure, hidden behind the one story that started it all. The bookstore. It had to be the bookstore. He now had a mission that went beyond simple survival. He had to get out of this mine, get back to the bookstore, find the device, and finish what his great-uncle had started. But how to get out? He looked at the map again. The path forward was a dead end. But there was another of Arthur's faint, dotted line annotations, leading from the end of the tunnel. It pointed to a symbol Liam didn't recognize at first, a series of wavy lines. Next to it, Arthur had written, "Subterranean river. The mountains drain. Flows southwest, exits at the old quarry. Path of last resort. Unpredictable and extremely dangerous." Just then, a new sound reached his ears, cutting through the silence. It wasn't the groaning of the rock. It was a low, distant rumble. A constant, powerful roar that was growing steadily louder as he moved deeper into the tunnel. The sound of moving water. He stood up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a new, desperate hope. He packed the notebooks away and started moving again, following the passage toward the sound. The air grew damp and heavy, the floor slick with moisture. After a few hundred yards, the tunnel ended abruptly. It opened onto a ledge overlooking a cavern. And in the cavern below, a river churned, its water black and fast, carving its way through the heart of the mountain. The sound was immense, a deafening roar that filled the space. This was Arthur's path of last resort. A wild, untamed force of nature that could either be his salvation or his tomb. He had no other choice. He checked his rope, took a deep breath, and began to search for a way down to the water's edge. The roar of the underground river was a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated through the rock ledge and into Liam's bones. Below him, in the erratic beam of his failing flashlight, black water churned and crashed, a force of raw, untamed nature hidden in the mountain's depths. Arthur's note had been a stark warning, unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Looking down at the violent current, Liam knew it was an understatement. But it was his only way out. He anchored his rope around a thick pillar of rock, the not one he'd learned years ago and hoped he'd never have to use. With Arthur's satchel strapped tightly to his back, he began the perilous descent, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the slick, vertical rock face. Icy spray lashed at him, soaking his clothes and making his grip treacherous. The deafening noise made it impossible to think, reducing the world to a simple primal focus. Hold on, don't fall. When his feet finally touched the narrow, rocky bank at the river's edge, he was already shivering, drenched to the bone. Now came the next impossible task. He couldn't survive in that current on his own. He scanned the bank with his light and found a small pile of debris washed up in a side eddy, thick, waterlogged timbers from the original mine, probably dislodged by a rockfall years ago. They were heavy and unwieldy, but they were his only hope. Working with frantic urgency, his fingers numb with cold, he used the last of his rope to lash 3 of the thickest timbers together. It was a pathetic excuse for a raft, a crude, unstable platform that looked like it would be torn apart in seconds. But it would have to be enough. He secured the precious satchel to the center of the middle log, tying the straps with shaking hands. Whatever happened to him, Arthur's research had to survive. He dragged the makeshift raft to the edge of the water, the current sucking and pulling at it hungrily. He took one last, deep breath of the stale mine air, offered a silent prayer to any god that might be listening, and pushed off. The moment the raft caught the main current, he was thrown forward with breathtaking violence. The rock walls of the cavern vanished behind him as he was dragged into a tunnel that was completely, terrifyingly black. His world shrank to the small, unstable patch of wood beneath him and the frantic, bouncing circle of his flashlight beam. The ride was a chaotic nightmare. The river was a living beast, slamming his raft against the unseen tunnel walls, spinning it in dizzying circles, and plunging it down short, steep drops that sent waves of freezing water crashing over him. He clung to the ropes, his knuckles white, his body battered and bruised. The roaring of the water was a constant, mind-numbing assault on his senses. His flashlight beam would occasionally illuminate terrifying glimpses of his surroundings, a jagged stalactite hanging from the ceiling, a whirlpool sucking at the side of the raft, a dark opening to another tunnel, like the gaping mouth of some sea monster. It was a journey through the planet's dark, violent arteries, and he was utterly at its mercy. Then, disaster struck. As the raft was hurled through a particularly violent section of rapids, it slammed sideways into a submerged rock. The impact was brutal, nearly throwing him into the water. The flashlight, knocked from his grip, flew through the air in a perfect arc, its beam spinning wildly before it hit the water with a soft plink and was extinguished forever. He was plunged into absolute, sensory-depriving blackness. The terror was immediate and overwhelming. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear anything but the roar. He had no idea which way was up or down, no way to anticipate the next rock or the next drop. He was blind, helpless, and hurtling through the dark. He squeezed his eyes shut, clinging to the wet, rough wood, reduced to a single desperate thought: hold on. He lost all track of time. It could have been minutes or hours. His body was numb with cold, his strength failing. He was starting to drift into a state of hazy delirium when he first noticed the change. The air. It was different. It was losing its stale mineral scent, replaced by the fresh, clean smell of pine and wet earth. The roar of the river also changed, the echoes becoming less sharp, suggesting the tunnel was opening into a larger space. He dared to hope. He lifted his head, his eyes straining in the impenetrable dark. And then he saw it. Not light, but a lessening of the black. Ahead, the darkness was no longer absolute. It was a deep, inky gray. And in that gray, he saw pinpricks of light. Stars. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made him pass out, washed over him. He had made it. The river burst from the mouth of the tunnel, carrying him out from the belly of the mountain. The crude raft, no longer constrained by the tunnel walls, was immediately torn apart by the churning water of a wide, rock-strewn pool. The timbers separated, and he was plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold jolted him back to full alertness. He kicked frantically, his waterlogged clothes and heavy boots dragging him down. His hand brushed against one of the logs, the one with the satchel. He grabbed it, using it as a flotation device, and kicked with all his remaining strength toward the nearest bank. He dragged himself out of the water, collapsing onto a bed of mud and smooth stones, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. He was alive. He was out. He lay there for a long time, the only sounds the gurgle of the water and his own ragged gasps. When he finally found the strength to sit up, he took in his surroundings. He was on the bank of a large, dark quarry pond, fed by the river emerging from the cliff face. Above him, a brilliant canopy of stars glittered in the clear night sky. He was free. But he wasn't safe. In the distance, across the rolling, dark hills, he could see a faint, orderly glow. The lights of Prosperity Peak. It was miles away, a deceptively peaceful-looking island in a sea of darkness. He had escaped the mountain, but his ordeal was far from over. He was a fugitive, soaked, freezing, and without a light. He had to get back into the one place he was sure they would be watching, the one place that held the key to destroying their perfect world. Shivering on the muddy bank of the quarry, he looked toward the town, every light a reminder that he was now a declared enemy. The first part of his journey was over. Now, the infiltration had to begin. For a long time, Liam did nothing but lie on the cold, muddy bank of the quarry, his body a single, agonizing symphony of pain and shivering. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape from the mine had vanished, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The night air, which had smelled so sweet and fresh after the stale confines of the mountain, was now a bitter enemy, leaching the last of the warmth from his drenched clothes and threatening to pull him into the deadly grip of hypothermia. He knew he had to move. To stay here was to die. With a groan, he forced his protesting muscles to obey, pushing himself to his feet. Every movement was a struggle. He peeled off his soaking jacket and shirt, wringing them out with numb, clumsy fingers. The cold bit into his bare skin, but he knew the damp fabric was worse. He put the clammy clothes back on, the initial shock of cold followed by the faint hope that his own body heat might eventually dry them. He scanned the quarry. It was an abandoned, desolate place, a huge scar left on the landscape. Rusted skeletons of old machinery stood like forgotten dinosaurs in the moonlight. One of them, a massive, derelict steam shovel, offered the best hope of shelter. He staggered towards it, his legs unsteady, and climbed into the rusted, graffiti-covered operator's cab. It wasn't much, but it was out of the wind. He huddled in the corner, pulling his knees to his chest, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He unscrewed the cap on his water bottle and drank, the lukewarm water a small comfort. He had Arthur's satchel, its contents his only reason for enduring this. He had survived the mountain. Now, he had to survive the night. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to retreat into the one place the cold couldn't reach, his own mind, and began to plan. After what felt like hours, the worst of the shivering subsided, replaced by a dull, persistent ache. He was alive, and the sky in the east was beginning to soften from black to a deep indigo. Dawn was coming. It was time to move. He crept out of the rusted cab and began the long, slow journey back towards Prosperity Peak. He couldn't risk the roads. He knew Evelyn would have people looking for him. She wouldn't just assume the mine had killed him, she would need proof. So he stuck to the woods, moving parallel to the main road, a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom. The journey was a slow, painful trek. He moved through tangled undergrowth and across dew-slicked fields, every step an effort. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a dull, hollow ache. But as he walked, his resolve hardened. The pain, the cold, the hunger, they were all fuel now. He thought of the placid, empty expressions on the faces of the retuned. He thought of his great-uncle, who had died fighting this silent tyranny. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for them. By the time the sun's first rays crested the mountains, he had reached a wooded hill that overlooked the western edge of the town. He found a thicket of bushes that offered a perfect vantage point and settled in to watch. From here, Prosperity Peak looked as serene and perfect as ever. A gentle plume of smoke rose from the bakery. A lone car moved slowly down Main Street. But Liam saw it now with a fugitive's eyes. He saw the unnatural precision of it all. He saw the cameras, small black domes he hadn't noticed before, mounted on the lampposts. And then he saw the patrol. A town utility truck, moving too slowly for a service call, cruised the perimeter road. He saw Dale from the hardware store in the passenger seat, his face grim, scanning the woods. Liam flattened himself to the ground, his heart pounding. They were actively searching. His infiltration would have to be flawless. He spent the entire day on that hill, watching, learning the town's rhythm. He saw the shift changes, the delivery times, the patterns of the few residents who came and go. He realized the town's greatest strength was also its weakness. Their obsession with a perfect, pristine facade meant all their attention was focused on the main streets. The back alleys, the service entrances, the spaces between the perfect storefronts, they were relatively neglected. That was his way in. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in the same hues he'd last seen before entering the mine, he noticed movement in the alley behind Gus's grub. It was Gus himself, wrestling a large bag of trash out to the dumpster. The diner was closing for the night. Liam watched, his stomach clenching with hunger at the thought of the food inside. Gus threw the bag into the dumpster with a loud clang. But then he did something strange. He paused, his hand on the lid, and looked around, his head swiveling nervously. He scanned the alley, his gaze sweeping the wooded hill where Liam was hiding. For a heartbeat, Liam was sure he'd been seen. but Gus's eyes passed over his hiding spot. Then, Gus reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small, brown paper bag and a bottle of water. With one last, furtive glance around, he placed the items on the ground behind the dumpster, partially hidden by an overgrown bush. He then closed the dumpster lid with a decisive thud, turned, and walked back inside the diner without a second look. A moment later, the lights inside went out. Liam stared at the spot behind the dumpster, his breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was a message. A lifeline. Gus didn't know if he was alive or where he was, but he was taking a huge risk on the chance that Liam might see it. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion. A discordant note in the town's perfect harmony. It meant he wasn't entirely alone. That small act of defiance gave Liam the surge of strength he desperately needed. He had a route. He had a mission. And now, he had an ally, however distant. He waited until the moon was high and Main Street was completely deserted. He took a final deep breath of the free night air. Then, pulling the collar of his damp, filthy jacket up, he slipped out from the cover of the woods and melted into the deep shadows of the first alley. The infiltration of Prosperity Peak had begun. The alley was a corridor of shadows, a stark, geometric world of brick walls and dark, empty windows. The oppressive neatness of Prosperity Peak extended even here, to its hidden spaces. There was no graffiti, no significant litter, just a sterile, ordered emptiness. It made Liam feel terribly exposed. Every sound he made, the scuff of his worn-out boot on the pavement, the rustle of his damp jacket, seemed to cannonade off the silent walls. His first objective was the dumpster behind Gus's grub. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, keeping his back to the wall, his body a compressed spring of tension. He reached the dumpster, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He crouched behind it, his eyes scanning the length of the alley in both directions. Nothing. He reached into the overgrown bush. His fingers brushed against a paper bag and a cool plastic bottle. He pulled them into the shadows with him. Inside the bag was a thick sandwich wrapped in wax paper, ham and cheese, simple and perfect, and a crisp red apple. It was the most beautiful meal he had ever seen. Huddled in the darkness, he devoured the food with a desperate, primal hunger. The bread was soft, the ham was salty, and the water was the sweetest, cleanest thing he'd ever tasted. It was more than just sustenance, it was a transfer of courage. Gus's small act of defiance refueled his own. He was not just a fugitive, he was a rebel with an ally. Strengthened, he stowed the empty bottle in his satchel and continued his journey. The bookstore was on the next block, but getting there meant crossing a more brightly lit service lane. He had to move through a labyrinth of smaller, darker alleys, sticking to the deepest pockets of shadow. The back of the bakery was warm and smelled of yeast. The back of the hardware store was a neat, orderly stack of empty paint cans. Every building was a small piece of the puzzle he had to navigate. He was halfway there, moving silently behind a large grease trap, when he heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. They were coming from the direction he was headed. He froze, pressing himself into the recess of a dark doorway, barely daring to breathe. Two figures rounded the far corner, their powerful flashlight beams cutting sharp, analytical paths through the darkness. As they drew closer, he recognized them. It was Carol from the flower shop, her pleasant smile replaced by a grim, focused intensity. With her was another resident, a tall, stern-faced man he'd seen at the diner. They were not strolling, they were patrolling. "Anything?" the man asked, his voice a low, clipped murmur. "Nothing," Carol replied, her voice losing its melodic, public-facing charm. It was flat and hard now. "Just a stray cat. Mayor Reed wants every alley checked twice before sunrise. She's certain he'll try to get back into town for his supplies." "He's more resourceful than she thought," the man grumbled, his light sweeping unervingly close to Liam's hiding spot. Liam held his breath, sure the pounding of his heart would give him away. Letting him get out of the mountain was a mistake. "The mountain will be his tomb," Carol said with chilling certainty. "But on the off chance it isn't, we'll be here. Let's check behind the real estate office." They moved on, their footsteps receding down the alley. Liam stayed hidden for 5 full minutes, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just a few people searching. The entire town was a network of watchers, mobilized and vigilant. They were all enforcers of the harmony. The close call made him even more cautious. He moved slower now, a shadow amongst shadows, until finally, he saw it, the familiar, slightly sagging rear wall of Vance's pages. He had made it. The back door was old and weathered, a single grimy window set into its upper half. A thick curtain of ivy clung to the bricks around it. He was home, but he was still locked out. He tried the front door key in the lock, but as he suspected, it was a different mechanism entirely. He peered through the dirty window, but saw only impenetrable blackness. He pushed on the window frame. It was bolted shut from the inside. Frustration and exhaustion washed over him. To have come so far, only to be stopped by a simple locked door. He sank to his knees, his mind racing. Arthur, his great-uncle, had been paranoid. He had known they were watching him. He wouldn't have relied on a single point of entry. There had to be another key. Liam's eyes scanned the ground, the wall, the door frame. He ran his hands along the rough brickwork near the door. His fingers brushed against a brick that felt different. It was slightly loose in its mortar. With a surge of hope, he worked his numb fingers into the gap, wiggling the brick back and forth. It came free with a soft scraping sound. He reached into the dark, hollow space behind it. His fingers closed around a small, cold, metal object, wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it. It was another iron key, old and heavy. A back door key. With trembling hands, he slid the key into the lock. It turned with a well-oiled, satisfying click. He slowly, silently, pushed the door open just enough to slip through, then closed it behind him, shutting out the hostile town. He was inside. The familiar, comforting scent of old paper and dust enveloped him like a blanket. He was in the bookstore's small, cluttered stockroom. He was safe. For a moment, he leaned his entire weight against the door, closing his eyes, allowing the first true feeling of relief to wash over him. He had done it. And then he heard it. It came from the floor above him, from the small apartment where his great-uncle had lived. It was a soft, rhythmic sound. The gentle, unmistakable creak of old wood under a shifting weight. The sound of someone sitting in the dark. The sound of a rocking chair. Liam's relief vaporized, replaced by a surge of pure, cold dread. He wasn't safe. He wasn't alone. The creaking sound from upstairs was a quiet, rhythmic metronome counting down the seconds of Liam's life. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee back into the alley and the relative safety of the shadows. But he couldn't. This bookstore was his only sanctuary, his only hope. If it was compromised, he was finished. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it, the exhaustion and the desperation had hardened into a defiant anger. He wasn't going to be scared out of his own inheritance. He slipped off his messenger bag, leaving it by the back door, and searched the cluttered stockroom for a weapon. He found a short, solid length of iron pipe, probably used to prop a window open. It felt heavy and cold in his hand. Armed, he began to move. He crept out of the stockroom and into the main part of the bookstore. The moonlight filtering through the large front window cast the towering shelves of books in an eerie, skeletal light. The silence here was different from the silence of the mine. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting. He reached the narrow, wooden staircase at the back of the shop that led to the apartment. It was the source of the sound. He took the first step, and the wood groaned in protest, the sound deafeningly loud. He froze, listening. The rhythmic creaking from above didn't stop. It continued its steady, unhurried pace. Whoever was up there knew he was here. They weren't hiding. They were waiting. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he continued his ascent, each step a calculated, silent placement of his foot. He held the iron pipe raised, ready to swing. He reached the top of the stairs. The apartment door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of pale moonlight spilling from the room beyond. The creaking was louder now, just on the other side of the door. He took a deep, steadying breath, gripped the pipe tighter, and kicked the door open, lunging into the room. The apartment was sparse, filled with books and maps, just as he'd imagined. In the center of the room, silhouetted against the large window overlooking Main Street, was a figure in a high-backed rocking chair. He couldn't make out their face, only their thin, slight frame. "Get up," he yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "Get up, slowly." The rocking stopped. The figure in the chair shifted, not with fear, but with a kind of weary resignation. A woman's voice, soft and raspy with age, but clear and steady, filled the quiet room. "I was beginning to wonder when you'd get here, Liam." The voice was so unexpected, so calm, that it threw him completely off balance. It was not the voice of an enforcer. He took a step closer, and the moonlight finally caught her face. She was an old woman, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a familiar spark. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but the underlying bone structure was undeniably familiar. She looked like the faded photographs he'd seen of his grandmother. She looked like Vance. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his grip on the pipe was already loosening. "How do you know my name?" "Because I was there the day you were born," the woman said, a faint, sad smile on her lips. Your great-uncle Arthur was my brother. My name is Ilara Vance. I am your great-aunt. Liam stared, his mind struggling to process the information. That's impossible. My family, they said Arthur's sister died decades ago. Did they? Ilara chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Prosperity Peak is very good at making people disappear. I never died. I just became a ghost. I couldn't stand the harmony, the pressure, the blank smiles. I wanted out. Arthur helped me. We staged my unfortunate accident, and I vanished from the register. But I never left. I couldn't leave my brother. I've been living in the spaces between, in the hidden rooms and forgotten tunnels of this town, for 40 years. She had been the one helping Arthur, the partner in his rebellion. You've been here? This whole time. Since Arthur passed, she confirmed, her voice catching slightly. I've been watching over his work, protecting it. I knew the lawyer had contacted you. I've been waiting for you to find your way back. Gus has been a help. He suspected you were alive after the incident at the mine. He has been my eyes on the town. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The journal entry, the key isn't for the mine. Not just for the mine. The key is for the cage. The device, Liam said, the words tumbling out. Arthur's resonator. The note said he hid it. He did, Ilara said, her eyes gleaming with pride. Right here, under their noses. She gestured around the apartment. He wrote that he hid it behind the one story that started it all. Everyone, even the mayor, thinks that refers to the Founders Accord. But Arthur was a historian. He knew the Accord wasn't the first story. It was the answer to a story of tragedy. She rose slowly from the rocking chair and gestured for him to follow her back down into the main bookstore. The first story of this town was written in a simple ledger, recording the names of the men who died in the mine collapse of 1888. A book of ghosts. Arthur considered it the town's true founding document, a testament to the individuality and the chaos they tried so desperately to erase. She led him to a massive antique bookshelf against the far wall, one filled with priceless-looking first editions. She ran her hand along the ornate wooden trim at its base until her fingers found a small, almost invisible indentation. She pressed it. With a low groan, a section of the bookshelf swung inwards, revealing a hidden, dust-free compartment behind it. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a strange-looking device. It was a complex assembly of copper coils, vacuum tubes, and modern circuitry, all mounted on a brass plate. In the center was a hollow space for the final component, and next to it lay a thick, worn leather ledger. The original casualty register, Ilara whispered, a note of reverence in her voice. And the resonator. She picked up the ledger and opened it. The inside had been hollowed out. Nestled within the carved-out pages was the core of the device, a complex oscillator made from a piece of the same dark crystal from the mine, carefully machined and wrapped in silver wire. He built it, Liam breathed, a sense of awe washing over him. He actually built it. He was ready, Ilara said, her voice filled with a lifetime of sorrow and defiance. He was ready to play them a new song. And now you are. Liam looked from the device to his great-aunt's determined face. The mission was clear, the tool was in his hands. For the first time, victory felt possible. And then, a sound shattered the moment. Knock, knock, knock. It was loud, sharp, and official. It came from the front door of the bookstore. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the front window, sweeping across the room. A voice called out, amplified and chillingly familiar. It was Mayor Reed. Liam Vance. We know you are in there. The town council requires a word with you. Open the door. They were trapped. Their sanctuary had just become a siege. The sharp, authoritative knock on the front door was like a gunshot in the silent bookstore. Liam froze, the newly assembled resonator feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. The voice of Mayor Reed, amplified and devoid of any warmth, echoed through the shop, a death sentence delivered in calm, civic tones. They were caught. Don't move, Ilara hissed, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. Her lifetime of living in the shadows had prepared her for this. While Liam's mind was still reeling from the shock, hers was already calculating, planning. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail, and pulled him back from the main room, deeper into the darkness of the stockroom where he had first entered. They'll be through that door in minutes, Liam whispered, his voice tight with panic. The back door. They'll have it covered, Ilara said, her mind working fast. They know you used it to get in. No. We don't run out. We run down. Outside, the knocking stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, the heavy rhythmic thud of a shoulder or a battering ram against the old oak door. The frame groaned in protest. Splinters of wood flew inwards. They were running out of time. Down where? Liam asked, his eyes darting around the cluttered stockroom. Arthur and I were not fools. We knew this day might come, Elara explained, her voice low and quick. She shoved a pile of old, bundled newspapers aside, revealing a section of the floor that was subtly different. We built a fortress, not a museum. She pointed to the resonator in his hands. Is it ready? Liam looked down at the device. The crystalline oscillator was now seated in its housing, but it wasn't yet calibrated or powered. It needs a portable power source. And I have to set the frequency. Arthur's note said it had to be precise. Then be precise and be quick, Elara urged. From a hidden compartment in the wall, she pulled out a compact, heavy battery pack and a set of small tools. Arthur prepared this kit for the final assembly. Everything you need is here. As the pounding on the front door grew louder, more frantic, Liam worked. His hands, still scraped and bruised from his ordeal in the mine, trembled as he connected the wires from the battery to the resonator. The sound of splintering wood from the front of the shop was a ticking clock, each crack a second lost. Where are we taking it? He asked, his focus entirely on the delicate circuitry. Where do we activate it? Arthur's calculations were clear, Elara said, keeping watch at the stockroom door. To shatter the harmony, the discordant note must come from the town's very heart. The highest point, the most central location. The place that marks the town's time, day in and day out. The clock tower at the town hall. The clock tower. It was directly across the square. The most visible, most protected building in Prosperity Peak. The plan was insane. It was perfect. The bells. Liam realized aloud. Could they amplify the frequency? That was his theory, Elara confirmed. A city of bells, ringing in a new kind of freedom. A final tremendous crash echoed from the front of the store, followed by the sound of the heavy door being thrown open and hitting the wall. Heavy footsteps stormed inside. Spread out. Check every room. He's here. It was Dale's voice, filled with an ugly, determined rage. Time's up, Liam said, making the final connection. A small light on the device blinked to life, a steady, pulsing green. It was ready. Now, Elara commanded. She moved to the corner of the room and heaved, pulling up a heavy wooden trapdoor that Liam had completely missed. It opened onto a flight of steep, stone steps leading down into a dark, musty-smelling cellar. This way. Quickly. Liam grabbed the resonator and his messenger bag, his great-uncle's research his most prized possession. He followed Elara down the steps just as a flashlight beam cut through the doorway of the stockroom above. In here, a voice shouted. The back room. Elara didn't hesitate. She pulled the trapdoor shut. They were plunged into darkness, but a moment later, she sparked a small, battery-powered lantern, casting a warm, flickering glow on the stone walls of the cellar. At the far end of the small room was not a wall, but a rusted iron grate. What is this? Liam asked, breathing heavily. The town's true history, Elara said, pulling on the grate. It swung open with a low groan. Before modern plumbing, the town was heated by steam from a central boiler. These are the old service tunnels. They run under all of Main Street. Forgotten by everyone. Everyone but us. She gestured into the dark, narrow tunnel beyond. They'll find the trapdoor, but it will buy us a few minutes. The clock tower's foundation connects to this network, if you know the way. Liam looked at his great-aunt, her face illuminated by the lantern's soft glow, and saw not a frail old woman, but a seasoned resistance fighter. He nodded, a new, fierce determination surging through him. They slipped through the grate and into the narrow, brick-lined tunnel. Above them, they heard the heavy thud of boots on the trapdoor, followed by muffled, frustrated shouts as their pursuers realized they had been thwarted once again. Liam and Elara were fugitives, entombed beneath the very streets of the town that wanted them dead. But this time, they weren't running for their lives. They were on the attack. They were headed for the heart of Prosperity Peak, carrying the one weapon that could tear its perfect, terrible harmony apart. The darkness of the service tunnel was a different kind of darkness than the mine. It was a man-made dark, smelling of cold iron, damp brick, and a century of forgotten history. Elara's small lantern cast a flickering, insufficient glow, creating dancing shadows that writhed on the curved walls. Liam moved behind her, the resonator clutched to his chest like a shield, its single green light a tiny defiant star in the oppressive gloom. Stay close, Elara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own footsteps and the steady drip of water from somewhere ahead. Some of these passages are unstable. Arthur and I mapped most of them, but you can never be too careful. She was the master of this subterranean world. She moved with a confidence that belied her age, her hand occasionally brushing against a junction pipe or a brick wall as if greeting an old friend. This was her true home, the unseen network that existed beneath the town's perfect facade. As they walked, they could hear the faint sounds of the world above seeping through the grates in the ceiling. They heard the low rumble of the town's utility truck, its engine a menacing growl as it patrolled the streets. They heard distant, organized shouts. They were being hunted, and the entire town was the hunting party. The sounds were a constant, grim reminder that they were moving on borrowed time. They paused at a larger junction where several massive, rust-covered steam pipes converged. "We can rest for a moment here," Elara said, setting the lantern down on a stone ledge. "How did you find all this?" Liam asked, his eyes scanning the labyrinth of tunnels around them. When Arthur first began to suspect something was deeply wrong with the town, he started with its history. Not the sanitized version in the town hall, but the real one. "The blueprints, the construction logs," she explained, her gaze distant. "We found the original plans for these tunnels. They were sealed off and forgotten in the 1930s. For the town, they were a relic. For me, they became a refuge. A place where the harmony couldn't reach. I could be myself down here." She looked at Liam, her expression softening. "Your great-uncle was a brilliant man, and a brave one. He never stopped fighting. When he realized what the crystal was really doing, he dedicated his life to finding a way to undo it. This device," she nodded toward the resonator in Liam's hands, "was his life's work, his magnum opus. I won't let it be for nothing," Liam said, his voice quiet but firm. He felt the full weight of his family's legacy settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. "I know you won't," she said. "Come. We're almost there." They continued on, the tunnel beginning to slope upwards. The air changed, losing some of its mustiness, and the brickwork became more uniform and well-maintained. They were no longer in the forgotten parts of the network. They were directly beneath the heart of the town. Elara stopped at the base of a rusted iron ladder that ascended into a square of absolute blackness. "This is it," she whispered, pointing upwards. "A maintenance hatch into the sub-basement of the town hall. From here on, we are in their territory. We must be silent." Liam went first, the resonator now strapped to his back. He pushed the heavy iron hatch upwards. It opened with a low groan into a large, dark space that smelled of dust and floor polish. The sub-basement. He climbed out, then helped Elara. They stood in the belly of the beast. The room was a maze of heating ducts, electrical conduits, and plumbing. The low hum of the building's electricity had replaced the drip of the tunnels. They were inside. Elara pointed towards a set of concrete stairs at the far end of the room. "Those lead to the ground floor. The access ladder for the clock tower is in the main records hall, at the top of the central staircase." They began to move, slipping between large boilers and water heaters. As they neared the stairs, they both froze. They heard footsteps from the floor above, slow and methodical, accompanied by a soft, tuneless whistling. A guard. Elara quickly pulled Liam into a small, dark alcove behind a massive electrical panel. They held their breath as the footsteps descended the stairs and a flashlight beam cut through the gloom. A uniformed security guard, a man Liam didn't recognize, entered the sub-basement. He did a cursory sweep of the room with his light, the beam passing mere inches from their hiding spot. The whistling was lazy, bored. He was just doing his rounds. After what felt like an eternity, the guard seemed satisfied. He turned, the whistling faded as he ascended the stairs, and a heavy fire door clicked shut above them. They waited another full minute in the tense silence before emerging. "They're getting sloppy," Elara whispered with a hint of satisfaction. "They think they have all the exits covered. They're not expecting an attack from within." They crept up the stairs and found themselves in a long, marble-floored corridor. It was empty. At the end of the hall, they could see the grand, sweeping staircase of the main foyer. And at the top of that staircase, they would find their final destination. They moved silently down the polished hall, their ragged appearance a stark contrast to the building's civic perfection. As they reached the base of the grand staircase, a new sound filled the air, growing louder with every step they took up. It was a deep, powerful, rhythmic sound. Thump-chunk, thump-chunk, thump-chunk. It was the sound of the massive gears and levers of the clock mechanism, turning with relentless, perfect precision. The sound of time itself. They had reached the base of the clock tower. The final stage was set. The ticking of the clock was a countdown to the end of Prosperity Peak's long, silent harmony. The journey up the clock tower was a journey into the belly of a mechanical beast. A narrow, winding staircase spiraled upwards around a core of colossal, relentlessly moving machinery. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and ozone, and the noise was overwhelming. The deafening thump chunk of the escapement mechanism, the grinding of massive gears, the slow, groaning swing of a 30-foot pendulum. It was the sound of Prosperity Peak's rigid, unyielding order. Liam went first, the resonator held tightly in both hands, its green light pulsing in time with the monstrous clockwork. Ilara followed, her lantern casting their giant, distorted shadows against the gears. With every step, the noise grew louder, the vibrations more intense, until it felt like the entire tower was a living, breathing creature. They emerged into the belfry, the highest chamber of the tower. The noise of the mechanism was slightly muffled here, but still a constant, oppressive presence. The room was open to the night air on all four sides through large, arched windows. In the center, four enormous bronze bells hung silent, dark behemoths waiting for a signal. Through the arches, the entire town was laid out below them, a perfect, sleeping grid under the cold moonlight. "Here," Liam said, his voice raised to be heard over the din, "this is the place." He set the resonator down in the exact center of the room. He pulled Arthur's final notebook from his satchel, the pages filled with the final, frantic calculations. "I need to input the activation sequence and the final frequency modulation. It will take about a minute for the core to energize." "A minute you may not have," Ilara warned, her sharp eyes scanning the stairwell they had just climbed. "Do it." Liam knelt, his fingers flying across the small keypad on the device. He entered the long string of code, his mind focused, blocking out everything but his gray tunkle's instructions. The green light on the device began to pulse faster, and a low, almost inaudible hum began to emanate from it, a counter-melody to the clock's brutal rhythm. He was just about to hit the final activation switch when a voice, cold and sharp as broken glass, cut through the noise. "I knew you'd come here. You have your gray tunkle's flair for the dramatic." Liam looked up. Mayor Evelyn Reed was standing at the top of the staircase, her face a mask of cold fury. She was not alone. Behind her stood Dale, his expression grim, a heavy wrench clutched in his hand like a weapon. "It's over, Evelyn," Liam said, his hand hovering over the device. "Is it?" she countered, taking a step into the belfry. "You see a prison, I see a garden, free of weeds. You want to unleash chaos on these people. You want to give them back their pain, their fear, their greed. I will not let you destroy this paradise. It's not paradise if you have to force people to live in it." Ilara retorted, stepping forward to stand beside Liam. Evelyn's eyes widened in genuine shock as she saw the old woman. "Ilara Vance, the ghost. So the rumors were true." Arthur's discordant little shadow. Her face hardened. "It doesn't matter. You are both relics of a failed world." "Dale." The command was simple. The big man from the hardware store moved forward, his target clear. "Liam." Liam scrambled back as Dale swung the heavy wrench. The tool whistled through the air, crashing against the stone floor where Liam had been a second before, sending sparks flying. The fight was a clumsy, desperate scramble around the massive, silent bells. Dale was stronger, but Liam was faster, fueled by adrenaline. As Dale lunged again, Ilara acted. She grabbed a long metal rod used for ringing the bells manually and thrust it, with all her might, into the spinning gears of the clock mechanism that were exposed in the floor. The gears shrieked, metal grinding against metal, and the entire rhythm of the tower faltered. Dale, his movements as synchronized with the town's rhythm as anyone, stumbled, his balance thrown off by the sudden chaotic lurch of the clockwork. It was the opening Liam needed. He tackled Dale low, sending them both crashing to the floor. The wrench flew from Dale's hand, skittering across the room. Liam scrambled back to the resonator. Evelyn was there, her hand reaching for the device to smash it. He lunged, grabbing her wrist. Her eyes, up close, were filled with a fanatic certainty. For a heart-stopping moment, they were locked in a struggle, a battle of wills over the small, humming machine. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Liam broke free and slammed his palm down on the large, red activation button. The effect was instantaneous. The low hum from the resonator erupted into a high-frequency tone that vibrated through the very stone of the floor. It was a sound that was felt more than heard, a piercing, discordant note that was the antithesis of harmony. The great bronze bells around them began to resonate. They didn't ring with their usual melodic chime. They began to scream. A single, complex, overwhelming wave of sound blasted out from the clock tower, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying, washing over the sleeping town below. The effect on Evelyn and Dale was immediate and violent. As people who were deeply, fundamentally attuned to the Founder's crystal, the counter-frequency was agony. They both cried out, clutching their heads as their internal harmony was violently shattered. They collapsed to the floor, writhing, the perfect, placid control broken. Liam and Ilara stood, buffeted by the screaming of the bells, and looked down at the town. Lights began to flick on, one by one, then in clusters, then in whole blocks, as if a wave of consciousness was washing over the residents. Doors opened. People stumbled out onto their perfect lawns, looking up at the sky, at their neighbors, at their own hands, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning wonder. The long, silent trance was broken. Liam looked at Ilara, her face streaked with grime, illuminated by the pulsing light of the resonator. She was crying, silent tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. In the belfry of the clock tower, surrounded by the screaming song of freedom, they watched as the people of Prosperity Peak began to wake up for the first time in 100 years. The harmony was shattered. Their fight was over. But for the town below, the messy, chaotic, beautiful story of what to do next was just beginning. The dissonant, liberating scream of the bells echoed across Prosperity Peak for 3 full minutes. To Liam, standing in the belfry, it felt like a lifetime and a single, breathtaking second all at once. Then, as the last of the battery pack's energy was consumed, the resonator gave a final, sighing hum and went dark. The piercing tone ceased. The bells fell silent. And for the first time since he had arrived, Liam heard the sound of true silence. It was not the oppressive, watchful quiet of the harmony. It was a natural, peaceful emptiness, filled only by the whisper of the night wind through the arches of the belfry and the distant, gentle rustle of leaves. The monstrous rhythmic ticking of the clock mechanism below them had stopped, its gears jammed by Ilara's desperate act. The town's artificial heartbeat had ceased. On the floor, Evelyn and Dale began to stir. The agony was gone from their faces, replaced by a profound and utter confusion. They looked around the belfry, at Liam, at the silent bells, as if waking from a dream they couldn't quite remember. The fanaticism in Evelyn's eyes was gone, replaced by a lost, hollow look. The carefully constructed certainty of her entire world had been shattered, and she had nothing to replace it with. What have you done?" she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "We gave them a choice," Liam said, his voice weary but steady. He felt no triumph in her defeat, only a deep, profound pity. He looked at Ilara, who nodded. Their work here was done. They left the two of them on the floor, disarmed and defeated not by violence, but by the breaking of a spell. They carefully made their way back down the winding staircase of the silent clock tower. The descent was surreal. The massive gears were still, the great pendulum hung motionless. The beast was dead. They walked out of the town hall's grand entrance and into the town square. The scene before them was quiet, strange, and breathtakingly human. The townspeople were out, drawn from their homes by the sound and the subsequent silence. But there was no panic, no rioting. There was only a quiet, collective bewilderment. They stood in small, uncertain groups on the perfect lawns and sidewalks, looking at the world as if seeing it for the first time. A man knelt, touching the petals of a prize-winning rose, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to understand the simple concept of texture. A woman stood staring at her own hands, turning them over and over, her expression one of dawning wonder. Two neighbors, who had likely exchanged thousands of pleasant, empty greetings, now looked at each other with the shy, uncertain curiosity of strangers. The perfect, placid smiles were gone. In their place was the entire, messy spectrum of human emotion. Confusion, fear, awe, sorrow. Liam saw a young couple holding each other, weeping silently, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of 1,000 suppressed feelings returning all at once. He saw Carol, the woman from the flower shop, standing alone. Her face, which he had only ever seen locked in a state of rigid cheerfulness, was slack with uncertainty. The mask had fallen, and the person underneath was lost. The front door of Gus's grub opened, and Gus himself stepped out. He looked older, more tired than Liam had ever seen him. He scanned the square, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He saw Liam and Ilara and slowly, hesitantly, walked towards them. "The hum," Gus said, his voice raspy. "It's gone. After all these years, it's finally quiet." He looked at Liam, no longer as a suspicious outsider, but as the catalyst for an impossible change. What happens now? Liam didn't have an answer. He looked at the sea of confused faces, at the town adrift on an ocean of newfound free will. Ilara stepped forward, her gaze soft as she surveyed the scene. "Arthur never wanted to destroy their world," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet air. "He just wanted to give it back to them. The good, the bad, the messy, the beautiful, all of it. Now Now they have to learn how to live again. How to choose. The first rays of dawn began to crest the peak, spilling a genuine warm, golden light across the valley. It was a real sunrise, not the picture-perfect imitation the town had always seemed to emulate. The light touched the faces of the townspeople, and for the first time, Liam saw not a collective, but individuals. He, the outsider, had come to this place to settle an estate, to sell off the last remnants of a forgotten relative. He had followed a trail of secrets, a guide left by a ghost. But in doing so, he had found something he never knew he was looking for. He looked across the square at the faded sign of Vance's Pages. It was no longer a burden, no longer a dusty collection of his great uncle's eccentricities. It was a repository of stories. And now, the people of Prosperity Peak were finally free to write their own. His journey was over. Theirs was just beginning. The sun climbed higher, a warm, impartial judge looking down upon the transformed town. In the square, the initial shock was beginning to give way to a fragile, tentative curiosity. The people of Prosperity Peak, a community of strangers who had lived side by side for generations, began to truly see one another for the first time. The silence was broken not by commands or pleasantries, but by hesitant, authentic questions. "Is that you, John?" I don't remember the sky being so blue." It was Gus who anchored them. He looked at the lost faces, at the dawning humanity in their eyes, and did the only thing he knew how to do. He propped open the door to his diner, letting the warm, comforting smell of brewing coffee spill out into the square. "The coffee's on," he announced, his voice rough but kind, carrying across the square. "Everyone, come inside. It's warm." It was a simple invitation, but it was exactly what they needed. A safe harbor. A place to start. Slowly, in twos and threes, the townspeople shuffled into Gus's grub. The diner, once a place of routine and quiet observation, was filled with a low, murmuring buzz of genuine human connection. Liam and Alara sat in a corner booth, watching the scene unfold. It was a series of small, profound miracles. Two elderly men, who had been neighbors for 60 years, were formally shaking hands, introducing themselves with tears in their eyes. Carol, the flower shop owner, sat at the counter, cradling a mug of coffee, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I was arranging the lilies this morning," she whispered to no one in particular. "I never knew they had a scent. All this time, I never knew." Even Dale, the hardware store owner, eventually appeared at the doorway, looking lost and ashamed. He wouldn't meet Liam's eye. Gus simply nodded to an empty stool at the counter and pushed a mug of black coffee towards it. Dale sat down, a silent, broken man whose certainty had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow confusion. The offer of coffee was not forgiveness, but it was a start. It was a recognition that he, too, was a victim of the harmony. "And Evelyn?" Alara asked softly. Gus, pausing by their table with the coffee pot, sighed. "Heard she's locked herself in the mayor's office. Won't speak to anyone. She can't face the chaos she spent her life preventing." Her reign had ended not in a blaze of glory, but in a self-imposed prison, a final retreat from a world she could no longer control. Liam looked around the crowded diner, at the faces filled with a new, raw, unfiltered life. He had come here to escape his own empty existence, to get rid of a burden left by a relative he barely knew. He'd stumbled into a town that was even emptier than his own life had been, its soul locked away. "You know," he said to Alara, his voice quiet. "For the first time since I got here, this place feels prosperous." Alara smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up her ancient eyes. "This is what Arthur wanted. Not for them to be happy, just for them to be free to try to be happy, to be free to fail, to be free to be human." She placed her frail, wrinkled hand over his. "He would be so proud of you, Liam." In that moment, Liam knew what he had to do. The thought of returning to his cramped apartment in Chicago, to his life of cynical detachment, felt impossible. It was like trying to fit back into clothes he had long since outgrown. His journey had ended here, but his life was just beginning. "I'm staying," he said, the words feeling more right than anything he had ever said. "This is my town now, too. My responsibility." Alara's smile widened. "I had a feeling you might say that." Liam left a few dollars on the table, then stood up. He and Alara walked out of the warm, noisy diner and back into the bright morning sun of the town square. They walked past the confused but hopeful faces, past the silent clock tower, and stopped before the faded sign and the dusty windows of Vance's Pages. Liam pulled the old iron key from his pocket, the key his great-uncle had left him, the key that had started it all. He slid it into the lock on the front door. The click of the lock turning was no longer a sound of obligation or dread. It was a sound of purpose. He pushed the door open, and the rich, familiar scent of old paper and history washed over him. But it was different now. It was not the smell of a tomb, but the smell of potential. It was the smell of a million stories waiting for a town that was finally ready to read them. He reached inside and took hold of the small, faded sign that hung in the window. He turned it over. In bold, clear letters, the other side read, "Open." He and Alara stood together in the doorway, looking out at the town. The sun was warm on their faces. The quiet murmur of real conversation drifted over from the diner. The future was unwritten, uncertain, and beautifully, terrifyingly free. The outsider was home. 1 month later. The silence of Prosperity Peak was no longer a novelty. It was the new, sometimes uncomfortable, reality. The hum of the founder's crystal was a ghost in their collective memory, and its absence had left a vacuum. In its place, a cacophony of new sounds had emerged. The tentative notes of a piano being played badly from an open window, the unfamiliar sound of a child's unrestrained laughter, and most frequently, the strained, awkward sound of arguments. Liam stood behind the counter of Vance's pages, which had transformed from a dusty mausoleum into a quiet, sunlit hub. The front door was always propped open now, a permanent invitation. The air smelled of fresh coffee, which he and Alara now served from a small pot in the corner, and the clean scent of new paper. Freedom, he had quickly learned, was not a destination. It was a messy, complicated, and often frustrating process. Carol from the flower shop was standing in the history aisle, holding 2 different books on gardening. "I don't know which one to choose," she said, her brow furrowed with a genuine, painful anxiety that Liam was coming to recognize in almost everyone. "Before. I just planted what was on the town schedule. Red tulips by the post office, white petunias in the town square hanging baskets. I never had to decide if I liked roses more than lilies." "Well," Liam said gently, "why don't you take both? Read them. See what speaks to you. Try planting something and see if it makes you happy. If it doesn't, you can always dig it up and plant something else." Carol looked at him, the simple concept of trial and error a staggering revelation. "Oh," she said softly. "I suppose I can. Thank you, Liam." This was his new role. He wasn't a liberator or a hero. He was a guide, helping people navigate the terrifying, uncharted territory of personal choice. The town's newfound freedom was coming to a head that evening. A town meeting had been called, the first real town meeting in living memory. It wasn't a scripted recitation of civic duties, it was an open forum for a populace that had forgotten how to govern itself. The community hall was packed. The mood was tense, a mixture of hope and fear. Gus stood by the door, a silent, grounding presence. Alara sat in the front row, a living piece of the town's forgotten history, her presence alone a call for order. The meeting began with a flood of grievances. An argument over property lines that had been irrelevant for a century. A complaint about someone's music being too loud. A tearful confession from a woman who admitted she felt purposeless without her designated contribution. The hall descended into a chaos of raised voices and pointed fingers. This was the discord Evelyn Reed had always feared, and for a moment, Liam felt a flicker of doubt. Had they made a mistake? Then Dale, the former hardware store owner and town enforcer, stood up. He looked haggard, his face etched with a guilt he couldn't scrub away. The hall fell silent. "I don't know who I am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For 30 years, I enforced the harmony. I reported my neighbors. I took part in the retunings. I believed I was a good man, a protector of our peace." He looked directly at Liam. "And now I know that peace was a lie. I don't know what to do with the man I see in the mirror. How do we live with what we were?" The question hung in the air, raw and painful. It was the question on everyone's mind. Before the chaos could start again, Alara Vance rose from her seat and walked to the front of the room. The townspeople looked at their living ghost with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "You live with it by remembering," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I remember this town before the Accord became a cage. I remember arguments, yes, and hardships. But I also remember barn raisings where the whole town came together to help a neighbor. I remember spontaneous dances in the town square. I remember real, earned joy, born from shared struggle. We have forgotten how to be neighbors. We must learn again." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The harmony didn't make you evil. It put you to sleep. The question now is, what will you do now that you are awake?" A thoughtful silence filled the hall. The anger had subsided, replaced by a sense of shared, daunting responsibility. It was then that Liam stood up. All eyes turned to him. "Alara is right," he began. You can't erase the past, but you can decide what to write next. He gestured towards the door. My great-uncle's bookstore was the town's memory. It held the stories of what this place used to be. I think it's time we started a new book. A book about what this town will become. He proposed his idea. A new town register. The Prosperity Peak Chronicle. A collection of blank books to be kept at the bookstore, where anyone could come and write. They could write down their memories of the harmony, their fears, their hopes, their ideas for new laws, their family histories, their poems, their arguments. Let's not be defined by a secret crystal or 100-year-old accord, he finished, his voice ringing with a conviction he never knew he possessed. Let's be defined by our own words. Let's build a new prosperity, a real one story at a time. The meeting didn't end with a perfect resolution. There were still disagreements, still fears. But the tone had shifted. There was a glimmer of shared purpose. Later that night, as Liam and Alara were closing the bookstore, the bell above the door chimed. It was Carol. She looked hesitant, but there was a new light in her eyes. That book you mentioned, she said shyly. The Chronicle. Is it started yet? Liam smiled. He walked behind the counter and brought out a large, beautiful, leather-bound book with nothing but clean, white, empty pages. He placed it on the counter. It is now, he said. Carol picked up a pen, her hand trembling slightly, and wrote the first entry on the first page. Liam didn't read it. The words were hers alone. He just watched as the first, uncertain, beautifully free story of the new Prosperity Peak was finally written. Autumn began to breathe its cool, crisp air into the valley. The leaves on the maple trees in the town square, once a uniform and predictable shade of crimson, now exploded in a chaotic, breathtaking riot of gold, orange, and red. It was as if nature itself was celebrating the return of variety. Inside Vance's pages, the Prosperity Peak Chronicle had grown from a single volume into a small collection. The books were filled with the town's raw, unfiltered soul. Liam would often spend the quiet afternoons reading the anonymous entries. There were poems of heartbreaking sadness for lost time, angry tirades against neighbors for petty slights, and joyful, wondrous descriptions of simple things. The taste of a peach picked fresh from a tree, the feeling of rain on one's face, the discovery of a favorite color. The book was working. It was a pressure valve, a confessional, and a shared diary all in one. The town was slowly, painfully, learning to speak again. But there were ghosts that could not be exorcised by words alone. Alara brought it up one cool evening as they sat in the quiet bookstore, the scent of old paper mingling with the cinnamon from her tea. They're still up there, you know, she said, her gaze drifting towards the window that faced the mountain. The crystal, the mine, and her, Evelyn Reed. In the month since the harmony had been broken, the former mayor had not been seen. She remained in her perfectly manicured house at the edge of town, a self-imposed exile. She was a symbol of their past, a question mark hanging over their future. Liam knew Alara was right. The town couldn't truly move forward while the specters of the old world still lingered. The next day, he made a decision. He walked through the town, past the residents who now offered him nods of genuine, if sometimes awkward, respect. He walked up the pristine path to Evelyn Reed's front door and knocked. There was no answer. He knew she was inside. He could feel her presence. He hadn't come for a confrontation or an apology. He had come to deliver a message. He took a brand new, empty notebook and a pen from his bag and set them on her welcome mat. It's Liam Vance, he said, his voice clear in the quiet air. The Chronicle is for everyone, Evelyn. Your story is a part of this town's story, too. If you ever decide you want to tell it, there's a blank page waiting for you. He turned and walked away, not knowing if she would ever pick it up. The choice had to be hers. He had simply opened a door. The second ghost was larger, a wound in the mountain itself. Another town meeting was called. This time, it was different. The raw chaos of the first meeting had been replaced by a somber, focused sense of purpose. Liam stood before the townspeople, but the decision was not his to make. The mine is still there, he said simply. The crystal is still in the heart of the mountain. It's dormant, but it's a reminder of what was. The question is, what do we do with it? A passionate debate followed. Some argued for its destruction, a final, violent catharsis. Others, a small group of the more scientifically minded, argued for its preservation and study. But it was Dale who provided the answer. He stood, his voice steadier now than it had been a month ago, his face still carrying the weight of his past, but his eyes were clear. We can't destroy our history, he said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. And we can't worship it, either. We have to learn from it. I say we seal the mine. We seal it for good, but we don't forget it. We mark the spot. We build a memorial, a place where we can take our children and tell them, this is where our freedom was nearly lost. This is what we must never forget. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. It was a perfect, elegant solution. Not vengeance, not denial, but remembrance. The following Saturday, nearly the entire town gathered at the base of the mountain. It was not a somber procession, but a purposeful one. They carried tools, bags of mortar, and heavy stones. Together, they made the difficult hike up to the Founder's Path, the secret entrance to the mine. This time, they walked in the bright, clear light of day. They worked all afternoon, a community reforged in shared purpose. They built a thick, solid wall of stone and mortar, covering the fissure in the rock face, entombing the crystal and its secrets forever. There were no speeches, just the quiet, rhythmic sounds of work. The scrape of trowels, the thud of stones being set into place, the low murmur of neighbors helping one another. As the sun began to set, Dale was given the honor of setting the final stone. His hands, which had once enforced the harmony, now sealed away its source. He pressed the stone into the mortar, a final, definitive act of atonement and closure. When the work was done, they didn't leave immediately. They stood together on the mountainside, a silent crowd of free people, looking down at the valley. They watched as the lights of their town began to flicker on, no longer a symbol of oppressive order, but a warm, welcoming glow. They had faced their ghosts. They had chosen not to erase their past, but to build upon it. Standing there, between the sealed tomb of their history and the hopeful lights of their future, Liam felt a profound sense of peace. The guide was no longer needed. The people of Prosperity Peak were finally finding their own way. The winter that followed the breaking of the harmony was a quiet, introspective time for Prosperity Peak. It was a season of healing, of families learning to talk to one another again, and of the first, hesitant words being written in the chronicle. And then, spring arrived. It came not as the orderly, scheduled event it had once been, but as a wild, chaotic, and breathtakingly beautiful explosion of life. For the first time, the gardens of Prosperity Peak were not uniform displays of civic pride, but vibrant, messy patchworks of personal expression. Carol's flower shop, once a purveyor of perfect, scentless blossoms, now overflowed with a riot of colors and fragrances. Her own garden was a glorious testament to her freedom, with clashing colors and unruly vines that climbed wherever they pleased. The sounds of the town had changed, too. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the soundtrack of real life. Music drifted from open windows, sometimes a beautifully played piano, other times a teenager learning the electric guitar with more enthusiasm than skill. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the streets as people finally began to personalize their homes, adding a new porch here, painting a front door a daring color there. The Prosperity Peak Chronicle, housed on a large lectern in the center of Vance's pages, had become the heart of the town's new civic life. It was no longer just a place for personal reflection. It had become their constitution, their newspaper, and their forum all in one. Residents would write proposals for community projects, and others would write thoughtful rebuttals on the following pages. Town meetings were now orderly, productive debates, with the Chronicle serving as the official record of their burgeoning democracy. They were governing themselves, one written word at a time. Ilara Vance, the town's former ghost, was now its most beloved resident. She had become the town's official historian, its living memory. Most sunny afternoons, she could be found on a bench in the town square, surrounded by a group of fascinated children, telling them the real stories of Prosperity Peak, tales of triumph, tragedy, and the messy, complicated people who had lived there before the long sleep. She was ensuring they would never forget the value of what they had reclaimed. Liam saw Dale often. The man had found his atonement not in words, but in work. He had organized a volunteer crew to restore the town's neglected historical buildings, using his skills to physically rebuild the community's connection to its authentic past. He and Liam would exchange a quiet, respectful nod whenever they passed. No more words were needed. Dale was rebuilding his own identity, one carefully restored brick at a time. One morning, on his walk to the bookstore, Liam found himself passing by Evelyn Reed's house. He had heard nothing from her, and the notebook he had left on her porch had vanished weeks ago. He expected to see the house in a state of neglect, a mirror of its owner's isolation. But it was not. The lawn was still perfect, the hedges precisely trimmed. It was an island of the old order in a sea of vibrant chaos. But as he looked closer, he saw something new. On the front step, exactly where he had left the blank notebook, sat a small, simple clay pot. And in that pot grew a single, perfect rose. But it was a rose of a color he had never seen before, a deep, dusky purple with streaks of silver. It was a unique, deliberate creation, an expression of self. It was Evelyn's answer. She was not ready to join their new world, but she had finally, in her own way, begun to write her own story. Liam smiled. He felt a sense of peace, of closure. He continued on to the bookstore, the bell above the door chiming a welcome that now felt like it was for him. The store was his life, his purpose. He had found his own designated contribution, freely chosen. He was helping the town find its stories. Later that day, a car with out-of-state license plates pulled up in front of the shop. A young couple got out, looking around with the curious eyes of tourists. They wandered into the bookstore, a place that now felt warm and alive. "Hello," the woman said, smiling a real, uncertain smile. "We were just passing through. This town, it feels different. Peaceful, but alive. What's it called?" Liam leaned against the counter, the warm spring sun falling on the worn floorboards, and felt a genuine, unforced smile spread across his face. "Welcome," he said. "This is Prosperity Peak." He looked at the title of his great uncle's journal, which now sat in a place of honor on the counter, The Outsider's Guide to Prosperity Peak. The guide was finished. A new one was being written every day, by every person in the valley. The outsider had finally shown them the way home. 1 year. It had been 1 year since the silence had broken, 1 year since Prosperity Peak had awoken from its long, placid dream. Liam sat at the old roll-top desk in the back of Vance's pages, the late afternoon sun casting long warm stripes across the floor. In front of him lay a new, empty, leather-bound journal, a gift from Alara. For a year, he had been the keeper of the town's stories, but he had not yet found the time to write his own. Today, on the first anniversary of what the residents now simply called the Awakening, it felt right. Outside, the town was not quiet. It was buzzing with a joyful, chaotic energy. They were preparing for the inaugural Festival of Voices, a celebration they had invented to replace the sterile, long-forgotten festivals of the past. There would be no scheduled blooms or mandated participation. There would be music of all kinds, a stage for anyone to read a poem or tell a story, booths for debating new ideas, and an enormous potluck in the town square. It was to be a festival of glorious, messy, unrestrained humanity. From his window, Liam could see the new life of the town in full bloom. He saw Alara, now the town's beloved matriarch, sitting on her favorite bench, regaling a new family that had recently moved to town with a true history of the clock tower. He saw Gus directing a group of teenagers on how to set up tables for the potluck, his gruff commands punctuated by laughter. The Chronicle, now a sprawling, multi-volume library of its own, had become the foundation of their new world. It was their memory, their conscience, and their guide, written in 1,000 different hands. A few weeks ago, Liam had hiked up the mountain to the memorial that sealed the old mine. He had found a single perfect, dusky purple rose resting at the base of the stonework. A silent acknowledgement from a woman who had chosen to write her story in the language of flowers. He had never seen Evelyn read again, but he knew, in her own way, she too was free. His own life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The cynical, drifting man who had driven into this valley seeking to unload a burden was gone. In his place was a man who knew the name of every child in town, who understood the subtle art of recommending the right book to a soul in need of comfort, and who had found a family in a sharp-witted old woman who had once been a ghost. He had found a home. He picked up his pen and opened the new journal to the first page. He thought back to the very beginning of his journey, to the first words he had read in his great-uncle's journal, the words that had started it all. He wrote them down now, his own handwriting clear and steady. They believe prosperity is a reward. I am beginning to suspect it is a cage. He paused, looking at Arthur's timeless observation. Then, below it, he began to write his own entry, the first and perhaps only entry this journal would ever need. He was right. Arthur was right about all of it. For a century, this town lived in a beautiful, quiet, and prosperous cage. But he was also a man who loved stories, and what he knew, and what I have learned, is that no story is interesting without a struggle. No character is truly alive without the freedom to make a wrong choice. The cage is open now. The silence is gone. And what I've discovered is that true prosperity isn't a reward you receive for good behavior. It isn't a place of perfect peace you finally arrive at. It's the feel of the sun on your face after a long winter. It's the taste of coffee shared with a friend. It's the sound of a noisy, chaotic, heartfelt argument in a town meeting. It's the freedom to choose your own words, to plant your own garden, to sing your own song, however off-key. True prosperity is the messy, beautiful, and unending work of writing your own story, every single day. And here, in this little town nestled in a quiet valley, our story is just beginning. He set the pen down. He closed the journal and placed it on the shelf next to his great-uncle's. The two books, the beginning and the end of the guide, sat together. The bell above the bookstore door chimed, and a group of residents came in, laughing, on their way to the festival. Liam smiled, a real, easy smile. He stood up, went to the small counter in the corner, and put on a fresh pot of coffee. There were stories to be shared, and the afternoon was just getting started.